Hey guys, tonight we journey back, way back, to a time before sneakers, denim, or fast fashion. Imagine stepping out into the blazing Egyptian sun, or walking down the marble streets of ancient Athens with nothing but a linen tunic between you and the elements. No Nike swoosh, no silk ties, not even a decent pair of sandals half the time. Just fabric, sweat, and a whole lot of sunshine. But here's the thing. Clothing back then wasn't just about looking good. It was survival. It was identity. It was a statement about who you were, what you did, and sometimes how much you had to suffer for it. So grab a drink, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft desert breeze effect, and let's talk about what people really wore when civilization was still figuring itself out. And hey, before we strip history bare, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. Let's get comfortable, because tonight we're going to walk barefoot through the world of ancient fashion. When you picture ancient Egypt, you probably imagine those clean white tunics fluttering in the breeze, right? Everyone looking like they just stepped off a movie set, with gold jewelry and eyeliner that never smudges. Well, sorry to break the illusion, but real Egyptian fashion was far more practical, sweaty, and honestly, sometimes smelly. The linen tunic wasn't about elegance at first. It was about not dying of heat stroke. Egypt was hot, so hot that even at sunrise, the temperature could make your clothes stick to you like a second skin. Linen, made from the flax plant, was the only real choice. It was lightweight, breathable, and easy to bleach into that pristine white color the elites loved. But don't be fooled, getting linen was no easy task. The flax had to be harvested, soaked, beaten, and spun by hand. By the time a single tunic was made, someone's hands were raw, their back was sore, and their patience was gone. So when you see a pharaoh wearing a crisp white kilt, remember, that was hundreds of hours of someone else's misery. Now, while the elite wrapped themselves in fine linen that shimmered in the sunlight, the working class didn't have it so easy. The average farmer, fisherman, or laborer, they might have had one basic garment, if that. Sometimes fashion meant wearing the same sweat-soaked cloth until it practically disintegrated. And shoes? Optional. Most Egyptians went barefoot, even in cities. The roads were dusty, rough, and littered with pebbles, but sandals were a luxury reserved for the wealthy. When you see hieroglyphs of servants carrying their master's sandals, that wasn't symbolic, it was practical. Rich people didn't want to wear out their fancy papyrus or leather soles, so someone else got the job of holding them until needed. Talk about awkward. Imagine following your boss around holding their shoes all day. And while we're here, let's talk about the idea of modesty. In modern times, we get all flustered if someone's shirt is a little too short, but in ancient Egypt, clothing wasn't about hiding the body, it was about keeping cool. The line between outfit and undergarment didn't really exist. Many workers and children went naked during the hottest parts of the day, and nobody batted an eye. You weren't showing off, you were surviving. Fashion was dictated by climate and class, not morality. Even high-born women who wore longer, tighter dresses called calasiris often left their shoulders bare. And those garments, they looked graceful, but moving around in one was a struggle. Try lifting a basket of grain or walking up a temple staircase in a dress so tight you can barely breathe. You'd start to appreciate the freedom of going barefoot and half-dressed. But linen wasn't just about comfort, it was about status. The finer and whiter your linen, the higher your social standing. The poor wore coarser, darker weaves. The rich flaunted near transparent fabrics that shimmered under the sun. Yes, you heard that right. Ancient Egyptian elites basically invented see-through fashion. The irony? They considered white the color of purity and holiness, but they were strutting around in fabrics so thin they could make a modern beach outfit look conservative. The priests took it even further, wearing perfectly white linen that symbolized ritual cleanliness. And woe to the poor laundry workers who had to scrub out the desert dust and sweat from those robes. Soap wasn't really a thing. Washing involved pounding the fabric in water mixed with ash or clay. Imagine doing that every week under the blazing sun. Ancient Egyptian laundry day was not for the faint of heart. Then there's the matter of adornment. Because even if your wardrobe was simple, jewelry made up for it. Gold, lapis lazuli, carnelian, turquoise. Egyptians loved color and shine. Men and women both wore bracelets, collars, and amulets, each with symbolic meaning. That cobra pendant on a noble's neck, it wasn't just fashion, it was protection, a statement of power. Meanwhile, the poor might wear beads made from clay or shells, but the idea was the same. Clothing might be plain, but accessories could tell your story. And don't forget the makeup. Men and women both lined their eyes with kohl, not just to look fabulous, but to block out glare and ward off infections. So yes, those eyeliner wings had a function too. The fascinating part. Egyptian clothing barely changed for over 2,000 years. Think about that. While modern fashion churns out a new trend every 6 months, Egyptians were like, nah, linen tunics work just fine. Their style was timeless, literally. And yet, when you compare that with ancient Greece, you start to see something interesting. The Greeks also loved simplicity, but their fashion philosophy had a different vibe. If Egyptian clothing was about survival and purity, Greek clothing was about form, flow, and freedom. The Greeks saw the human body as art, and their clothing, instead of hiding it, framed it. But that's where our story's about to shift, from the sweltering sands of Egypt to the breezy hillsides of Greece, where linen met wool and function turned into aesthetic philosophy. So, let's leave behind the Nile's shimmering banks and step across the Mediterranean to a land of olive trees, white marble, and gossiping philosophers. Ancient Greece, where everyone seemed to have an opinion about everything, including what you wore. Here, fashion wasn't just about surviving the climate. It was about harmony, proportion, and that all-important Greek concept, beauty as a reflection of virtue. In Egypt, you wore linen to not melt under the sun. In Greece, you draped wool and linen because it looked poetic when the breeze caught it. Aesthetic over comfort, pretty much. And yet, somehow, they managed to make it work. Picture an Athenian morning, the sun creeping over the Acropolis, merchants shouting in the agora, goats bleating in the distance. Men are adjusting their chitons, those tunic-like garments that looked effortless but were actually feats of controlled chaos. The chiton was basically a big rectangle of fabric, pinned or tied at the shoulders, then belted around the waist. Sounds simple, right? Except there were dozens of ways to style it. You could go short if you were a soldier or laborer, long if you were an orator or poet trying to look profound. No sewing machines, no fasteners, no zippers, just skillful draping and the occasional strategic pin. One wrong tug, and congratulations, you just invented the world's first wardrobe malfunction. And speaking of malfunctions, let's talk about the peplos, the quintessential garment of Greek women before the chiton became more popular. It was made from heavy wool and folded over at the top to create a double layer fastened with pins called fibulae. Those pins weren't tiny, by the way. They could be the size of small daggers. Fashionable, yes. Safe, not exactly. Ancient Greek playwrights loved to joke about women using their fibulae as makeshift weapons. And, honestly, given how sharp those things were, they weren't wrong. Wool might have been cozy in winter, but imagine wearing it in Athens during midsummer. Hot, itchy, and heavy. The trifecta of ancient discomfort. But you didn't complain, because complaining wasn't elegant. You simply adjusted your drape and tried not to sweat too obviously. Now, here's the kicker. Both men and women in Greece were versions of the same basic garments. There wasn't a huge divide in fashion like in later societies. What set you apart was fabric quality, color, and how you wore it. The rich could afford fine linen imported from Egypt. Yes, that same labor-intensive material that the Egyptians practically worshipped. The poor stuck to coarse wool from local sheep. Dyes were expensive too. White or natural beige was common, but if you were wealthy, you flaunted bright purples, reds, and blues. Purple, of course, came from crushed sea snails, thousands of them. Imagine the smell of that dye workshop. People literally reeked of status. Footwear, or the lack of it, tells another story. Just like in Egypt, most Greeks went barefoot, especially at home. Sandals were for the outdoors, made of leather thongs that left your toes exposed to the dust and heat. Soldiers had sturdier boots for the battlefield, but philosophers, they famously preferred to walk barefoot. Socrates probably left dusty footprints all over Athens. He believed comfort and simplicity showed moral strength. Try using that excuse the next time someone points out your dirty feet. But barefoot walking wasn't just philosophical, it was practical. Greek homes had smooth stone floors that stayed cool in summer. Plus, there was a certain pride in feeling connected to the earth. The Greeks didn't invent minimalism, but they definitely practiced it, sometimes because of philosophy, sometimes because shoes were just expensive. Then there's the himation, the ultimate Greek outerwear. Think of it as a toga's more sophisticated ancestor. A huge rectangle of cloth, gracefully draped over the shoulders and around the body. It was worn by both men and women. The art was in how you arranged it. A careless fold could make you look sloppy. A perfect drape could make you look divine. Politicians, poets, and citizens wore their himatia like statements of moral balance. The fabric's folds symbolized control, dignity, and proportion, values the Greeks obsessed over. Ever seen a marble statue of a philosopher wrapped in heavy cloth? One arm exposed, the other hidden. That wasn't random. That was fashion as philosophy, the visual version of self-discipline. And yet, for all their ideals, practicality still had its say. The Greeks knew how to work with their environment. The loose, flowing garments allowed air to circulate, keeping the body cool in the dry heat. Wool could be layered in winter, linen swapped in for summer, and since nothing was tailored, garments were easy to wash, repair, and reuse. Nothing went to waste. Old fabric could be turned into bedding, bandages, or cleaning rags. Even the wealthy weren't immune to thrift. Fine fabrics were prized heirlooms, passed down or re-dyed for new life. So while Greek art celebrates beauty and balance, Greek households were quietly masters of sustainability centuries before the word existed. Still, let's not over-romanticize it. The life of the average Greek wasn't a marble dream. Clothes got sweaty, stained and torn. Washing involved hauling water, scrubbing with clay or soap root, and beating the garments on stones. Laborers often wore short chittens, or nothing at all, while working under the sun. The idealized white-robed image of the Greek citizen, that's what they wanted to be seen as, not necessarily what they were. Real life was dusty, noisy, and full of laundry days. And remember those statues we admire today, all smooth white marble perfection. Originally, they were painted in bright colors. Greeks didn't live in a world of tasteful beige minimalism. They loved color, pattern, and contrast. Their fashion wasn't static. It was alive, constantly moving with the person who wore it. So, whether in the scorching fields of the Nile or the bustling streets of Athens, clothing told a story. It revealed your work, your wealth, your place in the world. But there was one other thing it revealed: how a civilization saw itself. Egyptians dressed for eternity, preserving order and purity. The Greeks dressed for movement, freedom, and beauty. And as both societies grew, their fabrics began to reflect something deeper: the relationship between human life and the divine. Because when your gods look like you, how you clothe yourself becomes a form of worship. And that's where the next part of our story takes us, to the spiritual and symbolic side of ancient dress, where fabric, color, and ritual met the sacred. So now that we've seen how fashion functioned in the dusty streets and marble courtyards of daily life, let's pull back the curtain and look at what all those garments meant. Because in both Egypt and Greece, clothing wasn't just a physical necessity, it was a spiritual language. Every fold, every fiber, every shade of color whispered something about the gods, about purity, about order. The way people dressed wasn't just about surviving the weather. It was about keeping the universe from falling apart, at least according to their beliefs. Take ancient Egypt, for example. These people didn't do casual. Every aspect of life, down to the thread in your tunic, had cosmic meaning. The Egyptians believed in Ma'at, the principle of order, truth, and balance. And that sense of order extended to fashion. White linen symbolized purity and divine alignment. It wasn't just clean in the literal sense. It was spiritually clean. Priests in the great temples of Karnak and Luxor wore perfectly white linen robes that had to be freshly laundered and ritually purified every single day. Imagine that. You wake up at sunrise, shave your entire body to avoid impurity, bathe in cold water from the Nile, and then slip into linen that's been washed and dried in sacred silence. Miss a step and you're unfit to stand before the gods. Fashion was a form of devotion, meticulous, repetitive, and sacred. Meanwhile, the pharaoh's wardrobe wasn't just about luxury. It was political propaganda. Every piece, from the striped Nemes headdress to the pleated kilt, screamed authority. Gold and lapis lazuli jewelry weren't just decoration. They symbolized eternal life and divine power. The crook and flail he carried weren't random accessories either. They represented his dual role as shepherd and disciplinarian of his people. Even the cobra on his crown wasn't just bling. It was the uraeus, a living symbol of protection and vengeance. One wrong outfit could literally be an act of sacrilege. If your role was sacred, your wardrobe had to prove it. You didn't just wear divinity, you performed it. Now shift the scene to Greece, and you'll find a completely different philosophy. The Greeks didn't dress to please the gods in quite the same way. They dressed to reflect human excellence, arete. The ideal Greek citizen was supposed to embody balance, control, and grace, and their clothing, with all its folds and geometry, mirrored that ideal. In temples and festivals, the draped fabric itself became an art form. During the Panathenaic festival, Athenian women, chosen for their beauty and virtue, would weave a new peplos for Athena. Not just any peplos, though. This one was embroidered with scenes of the goddess defeating giants, symbolizing order triumphing over chaos. When the finished garment was carried in procession and placed on Athena's colossal statue, it was more than a gift. It was a renewal of divine favor. The entire city watched as mortal hands quite literally redressed their goddess. It's fascinating how much effort both cultures poured into connecting clothing with the divine. Egyptians viewed their attire as tools to maintain the cosmic order. Greeks saw theirs as tributes to ideal human form and beauty. But both agreed on one thing: clothes had meaning far beyond fabric. Even the colors mattered. White, of course, for purity. Blue, for the heavens. Green, for fertility. Red, for vitality, passion, and sometimes chaos. Dyes weren't just fashion statements. They were coded prayers. To wear the wrong color at the wrong time could offend a god, or, at the very least, make you look like you didn't know your place in the cosmic pecking order. And then there was the ritual of preparation. Dressing wasn't just putting on clothes, it was a ceremony. Egyptians had perfumes and oils, not for vanity, but for purification. The scent of frankincense or myrrh was as holy as temple incense. Before rituals, priests would anoint themselves, transforming their skin into something divine. In Greece, bathhouses played a similar role. Before festivals or banquets, people bathed, oiled their skin, and dressed in clean garments. It wasn't just hygiene, it was a moral act. To be dirty was to be disordered. To be well-groomed was to show respect to the gods, the community, and yourself. But let's be honest, not everyone had time for all that spiritual fashion nonsense. Farmers, servants, and slaves had more practical things to worry about. In Egypt, the laborers who built pyramids didn't exactly get fresh linen daily. They worked nearly naked or wore simple loincloths, smeared with dust and sweat. In Greece, field workers rolled up their chitons or stripped down entirely to beat the heat. Their ritual was surviving long enough to eat dinner. Yet even they understood the symbolism. On festival days, everyone, even the poorest, would clean up, wear their best garments, and join the communal celebrations. For a few brief hours, fashion united the divine and the human. And here's where it gets poetic. Both civilizations linked fabric to eternity. Egyptians buried their dead in linen wrappings, layer upon layer, believing it would preserve the body and soul for the afterlife. The texture of linen was seen as eternal as the gods themselves, smooth, cool, incorruptible. In Greece, though they didn't mummify, they too wrapped their dead carefully, usually in simple white cloth. Death stripped away all the colors of life. Everyone met the underworld in purity. It's strange how both cultures, so different in geography and worldview, arrived at the same idea that fabric could be a bridge between life and what comes after. So as we watch these civilizations weave meaning into every thread, it becomes clear fashion wasn't vanity, it was philosophy. Each stitch held a worldview, each hem a prayer. And the more you look at it, the more you realize that the clothes themselves became silent storytellers of their civilizations. But fashion isn't just about meaning, it's also about making. And the next chapter of this story isn't about gods or temples, but about the people whose hands made it all possible, the weavers, dyers, and laborers who turned plants and wool into the fabrics that dressed empires. Let's strip away the glamour for a moment and focus on the unsung heroes of ancient fashion, the makers, because behind every immaculate linen kilt and every gracefully draped chiton were hands chapped from labor, eyes squinting in dim light, and backs spent from endless hours at the loom. The story of ancient clothing isn't just about pharaohs or philosophers. It's about the thousands of anonymous workers who made those garments possible, stitch by painstaking stitch. In Egypt, the textile industry was one of the most vital parts of the economy, and it was dominated, quite literally, by women. Picture rows of them sitting in workshops, spinning flax fibers into thread, their fingers raw from pulling plant stalks apart. The process started long before weaving even began. Flax plants had to be uprooted, soaked in water to rot away the woody parts, then beaten and combed until only the soft fibers remained. Sounds romantic in hieroglyphs, maybe, but in reality, it was backbreaking, smelly, and endless. Then came spinning, twisting those delicate strands by hand using a drop spindle, trying not to break the fibers. A single mistake meant starting over. And after all that effort, you still had to weave it into cloth. The looms themselves weren't what we'd call ergonomic. Early Egyptian looms were horizontal, stretched low to the ground, which meant hours of crouching or kneeling. Later, they developed vertical looms, but that just traded leg pain for shoulder pain. Every thread had to be pulled tight, every weave even, because imperfection wasn't tolerated, especially if the fabric was for temple use or royal garments. Quality wasn't optional, it was sacred. The most skilled weavers worked in temple workshops, producing textiles for priests and idols. Some of those fabrics were so fine, they were called woven air, transparent linen that shimmered like sunlight on the Nile. Imagine working months just to create a few meters of cloth, delicate enough to slip through a ring. And while men dominated other trades, weaving was seen as a feminine art, one tied to patience, precision, and domestic virtue. In Egyptian tomb art, women are often shown spinning or weaving, their calm expressions belying the monotony of the task. But don't be fooled by those serene faces. This wasn't leisurely embroidery by candlelight. This was industrial-scale production, powered by human endurance. The state demanded textiles as tribute, temples needed them for rituals, and the army required them for uniforms and wrappings. Somewhere in the midst of all that, fashion was born, not in palaces, but in sweat and repetition. Over in Greece, things weren't so different, though the tools and techniques evolved. Greek women, too, were expected to spin and weave, especially in noble households. In fact, a woman's reputation was often tied to her skill at the loom. Remember Penelope, the wife of Odysseus. Her cunning plan to weave by day and secretly unravel by night wasn't just clever, it showed her mastery of the domestic art that defined womanhood. A Greek man might boast about his victories in battle, but a woman's battlefield was her loom. It was where she proved her virtue, her intelligence, and her worth. Weaving was more than work. It was symbolic. The threads themselves represented fate, an idea the Greeks took to mythic extremes. The Moirai, or fates, were believed to spin the thread of human life, measure it, and cut it when time was up. In that worldview, every loom echoed the cosmic one. Every piece of cloth mirrored the pattern of existence itself, delicate, complex, and always hanging by a thread. So when women wove, they weren't just making fabric, they were participating in the eternal cycle of creation. But not all weaving was done at home. By the classical era, Greece had workshops and markets where professional weavers, often slaves or freedwomen, produced garments for sale. Unlike the idealized domestic scenes on painted vases, these were noisy, crowded places filled with dust, chatter, and the rhythmic clack of wooden looms. Wool was the dominant material, carded and cleaned before spinning. Dyes were prepared in vats nearby, the air heavy with the tang of fermented mordants and crushed plants. Blue from woad, yellow from saffron, red from madder. Each batch was stirred by hand, and the smell could knock out a modern nose in minutes. But those colors, when they caught the light, made the hardship worth it. And speaking of dyes, let's not romanticize them too much. The famed Tyrian purple, the color of royalty, came from sea snails called murex. The process was, frankly, disgusting. Workers cracked open thousands of snails, extracted a tiny gland, and let it rot in the sun before boiling it down to dye a single garment. The stench was legendary. Ancient writers compared it to decaying corpses. The people who worked those dye pits probably smelled so bad that even their shadows fled. But the result? A deep, shimmering purple that never faded, worth more than gold. When you saw a Greek statesman or a Roman general in a purple cloak, you weren't just looking at wealth. You were looking at suffering, condensed into color. Back in Egypt, the most prized linen wasn't dyed at all. Its brilliance came from meticulous bleaching in the sun. Workers laid the fabric out on fields, watering it repeatedly until it turned a blinding white. The whiter the cloth, the more sacred and expensive it was. A fine piece of linen could outvalue livestock or land. And because of the desert's dry air, some of those fabrics have survived for millennia, tucked away in tombs, still smooth, still light, still whispering of the people who made them. It's almost poetic, isn't it? Both civilizations, so different in their philosophies, were united by the rhythm of thread and loom, weaving connected farmers, sleeves, and queens alike. It shaped economies, defined gender rules, and wove itself into religion and myth. When you think about it, those ancient fabrics were the Wi-Fi of their world, connecting everyone through invisible strands of labor and meaning. But if making the fabric was one struggle, wearing it properly was another art form entirely, because in both Egypt and Greece, how you wore your clothes mattered almost as much as the clothes themselves. And the next part of our journey reveals the rituals, rules, and even the occasional fashion disasters that came with dressing the ancient way.
Let's talk about the performance of dressing, because in the ancient world, clothing wasn't something you just put on. It was an event, a ritual, a statement carefully orchestrated every morning to say, "This is who I am, where I stand, and who's above or beneath me." Getting dressed wasn't about modesty or convenience. It was about identity. And if you thought modern fashion influencers were dramatic, wait until you meet an Egyptian noble or a Greek statesman trying to get his drape just right. In Egypt, the ritual of dressing began with cleanliness, not metaphorical cleanliness, literal, squeaky, scrub-yourself-raw cleanliness. Daily bathing was practically a civic duty, especially for those who could afford it. Wealthy Egyptians had servants who'd fetch water, grind natron salt for soap, and even apply scented oils afterward. Men shaved their entire bodies. Women did too, except for a few artfully arranged locks. Hair was seen as dirty, chaotic, almost animalistic, so most elites wore wigs instead. Real hair, styled to perfection, perfumed and powdered, was considered the height of refinement. The fancier your wig, the higher your status. And they weren't subtle about it. These things were big, elaborate, and sometimes ridiculously heavy. Imagine holding your head up while balancing a mini sand dune of braids and beads. Then came the linen. It wasn't simply draped. It was folded, pleated, and wrapped with almost mathematical precision. The pleats weren't sewn. They were set by hand, using starch and pressing tools, often by servants who knew exactly how to get that symmetrical ripple that screamed royalty. There were distinct styles depending on rank and gender. Men wore short kilts called shendit, simple at first, then increasingly elaborate with pleated panels or decorative sashes as time went on. Women's dresses evolved from tight tube-like gowns to more intricate, pleated garments that hugged the body. The elite practically shimmered in the sun, their linen translucent, their jewelry gleaming like molten gold. Ordinary folks, they were lucky if their tunic had both shoulders intact. Jewelry completed the transformation. No Egyptian outfit was considered finished without color. wide-collared necklaces, called wesek, layered with rows of turquoise, lapis, and carnelian, lay heavy on the chest. Anklets, bracelets, rings, and amulets jingled softly with each movement. And it wasn't just about vanity. Each piece carried meaning. A scarab for rebirth, an eye of Horus for protection, a lotus for purity. You didn't wear accessories to match your outfit. You wore them to balance your soul. Even makeup had divine function. Kohl around the eyes reduced glare from the sun and repelled flies. Red ochre on the lips and cheeks signaled vitality. So yes, they wore makeup to survive, but also to declare that they were part of the cosmic order. It's like wearing sunscreen and saying a prayer at the same time. Across the sea in Greece, getting dressed was a whole different kind of art, less sacred, more performative. No pins, buttons, or zippers, just fabric, gravity, and skill. You didn't put on the chiton, you constructed it around yourself. Draping was the Greek equivalent of tailoring, and the goal wasn't perfection, it was flow. The Greeks admired movement, the way a breeze could ripple through folds of linen, or how a speaker's gestures sent fabric cascading like a wave. The visual rhythm of clothing was almost an extension of speech itself. That's why public figures obsessed over how they stood and moved. A clumsy fold or awkward posture could ruin an entire speech faster than a bad joke. But make no mistake, this was no quick morning routine. Wealthy Greeks had slaves to help with dressing, ensuring the folds fell just so and the fibulae were placed without stabbing anyone. Women's clothing, especially, could be elaborate. The peplos and chiton both required careful layering, adjusting, and pinning. The heavier the fabric, the more effort it took to make it look effortless. And if you think wardrobe malfunctions are a modern invention, think again. One misplaced pin, one overzealous gesture, and suddenly half your garment is on the floor in front of an audience of horrified philosophers. Greeks, too, loved their jewelry, but theirs leaned toward elegance rather than flamboyance. Gold wreaths, delicate earrings, and engraved signet rings spoke quietly of wealth. And hair? Oh, hair was serious business. Men kept theirs short and neat, unless there were Spartans who famously wore it long as a sign of pride, while women spent hours braiding, curling, and binding their hair with ribbons or diadems. Wigs were rare, but scented oils were common. If you walked past a wealthy Greek matron, you'd probably smell her before you saw her. And then there was perfume. Both Egyptians and Greeks adored it, though they made it differently. Egyptians distilled oils infused with myrrh, frankincense, or lotus. The scent clung to their clothes, their wigs, even their skin after bathing. The Greeks, meanwhile, turned perfuming into a ritual of sensuality. They rubbed fragrant oils into their skin, hair, and garments. Scent became a kind of invisible clothing, an aura that followed you. Some perfumes were so strong they could announce your arrival before you entered the room. Others were symbolic offerings to the gods, used in temples or at funerals. Smelling good wasn't just about attraction, it was about being civilized. But of course, not everyone had the luxury of a morning perfume ritual or a personal dresser. Ordinary Greeks and Egyptians lived far more practical lives. A farmer's fashion statement was whatever didn't rip while he worked. A market woman's jewelry might be a single bronze ring passed down from her mother. Yet even they observed small rituals, washing before meals, freshening their tunics before festivals, rubbing a little oil on their skin after a long day. It was the universal human urge to feel clean, dignified, and human, even when life was anything but. And here's what's fascinating. Both societies used clothing to create illusion. In Egypt, your spotless linen showed purity, even if your life was messy. In Greece, your drapes showed grace, even if you were broke. Fashion was theater, a costume that made the world believe your role. And just like in modern life, some people took that theater way too seriously. Because when humans start competing over who looks cleaner, holier, or more elegant, you can bet it doesn't end with just pretty clothes. It ends with rules, judgment, and of course, fashion scandals. And those, my friend, are coming next. Fashion scandals. Because humanity can't resist turning a piece of fabric into a symbol of virtue, rebellion, or pure vanity. The ancient world wasn't short on them. Every era had its share of wardrobe controversies, people pushing boundaries and others clutching their pearls or lotus amulets in moral outrage. Clothing wasn't just what you wore, it was what you said without speaking. And if you said the wrong thing, oh, people noticed. In ancient Egypt, your outfit could literally get you killed if you weren't careful about context. Imagine being a servant wearing a collar that looked too fine or linen that was too white. Suddenly, you might be accused of impersonating nobility. Egyptian society was so obsessed with purity and order that the color of your clothing could imply moral worth. Priests, for instance, had to wear the purest white linen, perfectly clean, free of stain, freshly laundered. It wasn't just symbolic, it was mandated by temple law. They had to bathe multiple times a day, shave all body hair,
and change garments constantly to maintain ritual purity. Meanwhile, ordinary folks were lucky to wash their tunics once a week. You can imagine how that gap in hygiene also created a gap in social judgment. Cleanliness wasn't next to godliness, it was godliness.
But Egypt also had a secret undercurrent of sensuality in fashion. The tight-fitting dresses and translucent linen that later shocked Victorian archaeologists, those were worn proudly by Egyptian women. The elite celebrated the human body. They didn't hide it. A noble woman's gown might fitting to her shape so closely that modern audiences might call it risque. Yet for the Egyptians, it wasn't scandalous. It was beauty in harmony with nature, with Ma'at, the divine order. Ironically, it was the foreign conquerors, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, who later found such openness improper. Egypt had fashion freedom long before others caught up. The Greeks, on the other hand, wrote entire philosophical treatises about fashion and morality. To them, clothing was a reflection of the soul. A modest chiton represented discipline. An overly embroidered one reeked of vanity and corruption. The Spartan lawgiver, Lycurgus, outright banned gold and elaborate dress, insisting that simplicity made better warriors. Spartan women, though, got away with wearing short tunics for athletic training, so short that other Greeks found them scandalous. Athens, meanwhile, loved a good spectacle. Wealthy men strutted through the agora draped in fine-dyed chitons while pretending to be humble philosophers. And the philosophers themselves? Some took pride in doing the opposite, wearing nothing but coarse cloaks to signal how little they cared for appearances. Take Diogenes, for example. The man who lived in a barrel and mocked everyone's pretensions. He wore a dirty, tattered cloak as a kind of anti-fashion manifesto. When asked why he dressed like a beggar, he replied, "I cover my shame, not my vanity." Out. But even his so-called simplicity became a kind of fashion in itself, a carefully cultivated image of defiance. The irony? He probably spent more time being seen than most of the people he criticized. And then there were the symposia, the Greek equivalent of after-parties for the elite. Picture it: wine, music, flirting, and dress codes. Men wore light tunics or sometimes nothing at all, their skin oiled and perfumed. Women, usually entertainers or courtesans, wore colorful, revealing garments, sheer fabrics, and glittering jewelry. The respectable Athenian wife? She stayed home, of course. Public display of beauty was reserved for others. That double standard was woven into the very fabric of Greek society. Still, scandals brewed when the lines blurred. A woman appearing unveiled in public, or a man wearing clothing too soft or too Eastern, could set tongues wagging. The Athenians were especially suspicious of luxury. After all, excess reminded them of Persia, their great enemy, and nothing insulted a Greek patriot more than looking like a Persian prince. Yet, paradoxically, they adored imported Persian silks and perfumes. Hypocrisy, thy name was Athens. Speaking of Persia, let's step into the empire of robes and opulence. If Egypt embodied purity and Greece elegance, Persia embodied grandeur. The Achaemenid court was a blaze of color and embroidery, an explosion of pattern and fabric. The king's garments were not merely clothes, they were architecture. Layer upon layer of embroidered silk, wide sleeves, flowing trousers, jeweled belts. The Persians loved symmetry and detail. Every stitch declared wealth and divine favor. And they didn't hide their extravagance. they flaunted it. But even in Persia, there was a hierarchy to how much you could shine. Only the king wore certain colors, royal purple, deep crimson, or the legendary Tyrian dye extracted from sea snails and worth its weight in silver. The nobility followed suit with gold-threaded patterns and patterned trousers that scandalized Greeks, who considered pants, yes, pants, effeminate and barbaric. To the Greeks, real men let their legs breathe. To the Persians, exposed legs were vulgar. One man's modesty was another man's indecency. And then came the ultimate act of rebellion, adopting the enemy's fashion. When Alexander the Great conquered Persia, his Greek companions were horrified to see him don Persian robes. To them, it was betrayal. Alexander, the conqueror of the East, dressing like the conquered. But to Alexander, it was political genius. Clothing wasn't submission, it was diplomacy. He understood that power could be expressed through fabric as easily as through the sword. To rule Persians, he needed to look like one. It was fashion as empire building. That theme, the politics of clothing, echoed everywhere. What you wore told people where you stood, who you served, and what gods you honored. But it also had the power to change those things. Every time someone bent the rules, whether an Egyptian priest sneaking a colored sash into his white robes, or a Greek woman stepping out unveiled, they weren't just breaking dress codes. They were testing the limits of social order. Because clothing wasn't just about covering the body, it was about revealing the boundaries of power, purity, and rebellion. And the more powerful a civilization became, the more it needed those boundaries to hold. But power never holds forever, and when it begins to crack, even the finest linen can't hide the stains. And so, as we move deeper into the story of how ancient people wore their worlds, we'll find that some cracks started to show, not in the clothes, but in the civilizations themselves. Let's talk about the people who actually made those garments, the hands behind the beauty. Because for all the royal opulence and temple cleanliness, someone had to weave, spin, dye, and stitch every piece of cloth that fluttered down the Nile or draped across the Aegean breeze. And spoiler alert, it wasn't the gods or philosophers doing the weaving. It was mostly women, servants, and slaves working in the shadows, their daily grind literally holding civilization together thread by thread. In Egypt, textile work was both art and survival. Linen, the pride of the Nile, started as humble flax, a tough, fibrous plant that had to be soaked, beaten, split, and combed before it even resembled thread. It was back-breaking, sunburn-level work. The women who spun flax sat on low stools, twisting fibers into thread with wooden spindles, their fingers constantly raw from friction. The rhythmic spin of thread was a sound so common it probably faded into the background of Egyptian villages, like the buzz of insects or the slap of water against the riverbanks. Yet this ordinary music of labor produced the very fabric that kings were buried in. Workshops run by temples or wealthier states could employ dozens, even hundreds of workers. Some specialized in spinning, others in weaving, others still in dyeing or finishing the cloth. These weren't the glamorous weavers of mythology. They were laborers, often paid in grain or oil. Their days began at dawn, working under overseers who measured their output down to the cubit of cloth. Ancient administrative records show lines of workers' names beside their quotas, and you can almost hear the sighs of frustration. Short by half a cubit again? No rations for you. Efficiency wasn't just encouraged, it was demanded. But the product of that labor? Astonishing. Egyptian linen was famous across the ancient world. Fine, light, and so smooth that even centuries later, archaeologists found it nearly intact in tombs. It's ironic, isn't it? The fabric worn by the living to survive the sun is the same fabric that preserved the dead for eternity. Linen was Egypt's gift to eternity. Now cross the sea to Greece, and the rhythm changes. Greek women, especially in rural households, spent endless hours at the loom. Spinning and weaving weren't just chores, they were expectations. A good wife managed her oikos, her household, with skill and efficiency, and that meant producing the family's garments. Even noble women, at least in theory, were supposed to know how to weave. Homer's Odyssey paints Penelope as the perfect image of virtue, weaving by day and unweaving by night. A metaphor for loyalty and cleverness, yes, but also a reminder that weaving was woman's work, sacred and binding. The loom wasn't just a tool, it was a symbol of domestic virtue and control. Greek men might conquer cities, but Greek women conquered chaos with their threads. And yet, the irony was that while women's weaving sustained society, they had little say in the public life it supported. Every thread they spun clothed philosophers, generals, and priests, but none of those threads led to freedom for the hands that made them. Still, there was a kind of quiet power in it. The loom was both confinement and creation. The patterns woven into cloth often carried meaning, geometric designs, symbolic knots, or colored borders that spoke of family, region, or devotion. When a mother wove her son's cloak before he left for war, it wasn't just fabric. It was protection, memory, a silent prayer wrapped around his shoulders. Ancient texts even mention heroes recognized by the cloaks their mothers made. Imagine being known not by your armor, but by your mom's handiwork. That's ancient family branding right there. And then there were the dyes, the wild chemistry of the ancient world. If linen was Egypt's canvas, then color was the artist's rebellion. Egypt preferred white, but when color appeared, it was subtle and symbolic. Ochre, indigo, saffron, each required skill and patience to extract from plants, minerals, or insects. The process could take days, sometimes weeks. Dyers were part alchemist, part gambler, because one mistake could ruin an entire batch. The smell? Horrific. Picture vats of rotten plant matter in the desert sun. You'd need the nose of a god to stand it. Greece took color to new heights. Wool, not linen, was the primary fabric there, and it soaked up dyes beautifully. Reds from madder root, yellows from saffron, blues from woad, purples from the rare and expensive murex snail. That last one was the status symbol of status symbols. It took tens of thousands of snails to make a single ounce of dye, and the process involved fermenting them in salt water until the mixture turned into a deep, rich hue that screamed, "I am important and I probably smell awful." Royal purple wasn't just a color, it was a declaration of supremacy. It's funny how much effort went into what seems, at first glance, like vanity. But in ancient societies, color was never just fashion. It told stories about wealth, purity, origin, and belief. A priest in white, a soldier in crimson, a bride in saffron, all instantly recognizable, all bound by codes older than memory. And behind those codes were workers, the invisible artists who mixed the dyes, twisted the thread, and pushed the looms. Their names rarely appear in history, but their work is everywhere. In the shrouds of kings, in the robes of philosophers, in the tunics of soldiers and the veils of brides. Civilization itself was literally stitched together by hands that history forgot. So, when you picture an ancient Egyptian noble stepping out in pristine linen, or a Greek aristocrat reclining in a dyed ketone, remember this: somewhere, someone's fingers bled for that beauty, and they probably didn't even get a mention in the scrolls. But that's the thing about ancient fashion. It's both surface and story. The elegance hides the labor, the color hides the cost. And as we move further along this thread of history, you'll see that those contradictions between beauty and suffering, luxury and toil, never really went away. They just changed their fabric. Now, if you think ancient fashion was all about looking good and sweating less, you'd only be half right. Because in a world where sandstorms met sea breezes and desert heat met mountain chill, clothing had to be practical first, fashionable second. These weren't people strutting through marble halls for selfies. They were farmers, builders, sailors, priests, and slaves, and every layer of cloth served a purpose. Whether in the baking sun of Egypt or the unpredictable seasons of Greece, dressing right could mean the difference between comfort and heat stroke or between respect and ridicule. Let's start with the basics, the barefoot life. Most Egyptians went without shoes entirely, and it wasn't just a choice. It was culture. The Nile Valley's soft soil and warm climate made footwear almost unnecessary, and going barefoot was even seen as a kind of purity, especially in sacred spaces. Priests entered temples unshod, believing that touching the holy ground with bare feet brought them closer to the divine. In fact, sandals were often considered dirty or impure inside temples, which flips our modern logic entirely. Imagine walking into a fancy building today and being told, "Sorry, shoes off, it's sacred." But, of course, sandals existed, and they said a lot about who you were. The simplest ones were made from woven papyrus or palm fibers, worn by farmers or laborers. They didn't last long, but were easy to replace. The wealthier crowd preferred leather sandals, sometimes dyed or decorated with gold leaf, beads, or even semi-precious stones. Pharaohs and nobles often had sandals made just to match their outfits. Some were even inscribed with images of conquered enemies on the soles. So yes, they literally stepped on their rivals every time they walked. Ancient fashion could be petty and political. In Greece, though, going barefoot wasn't quite as normal. Sure, farmers and kids might skip shoes, but the average Greek adult owned at least one pair of sandals or boots. The crepide, a kind of strappy sandal, was the classic, simple choice, while heavier boots like the embus or cotornus were worn by travelers and soldiers. And let's not forget the theatrical side. Actors in tragedies wore platformed boots called cotorni to appear taller and more heroic. That's right, ancient Greeks invented stage heels centuries before drag queens and runway models made them iconic again. But clothes weren't just about class or vanity. They were about adapting to climate. Egypt's linen tunics were like air conditioning you could wear. The fabric's loose weave let air circulate, and the pale colors reflected sunlight. Even the simplest peasant tunic kept its wearer cool while protecting the skin from sunburn. When the heat got unbearable, people simply loosened or shortened their garments. There was no shame in comfort. Half the population worked shirtless anyway. Linen was like the great equalizer, simple, breathable, and, when freshly washed, surprisingly elegant. Greece, by contrast, had a trickier environment. Scorching summers and cool winters, dry days and humid nights. So the Greeks invented the art of layering. The chiton was your base, light and airy for daytime, but when the wind picked up, on came the himation, a large rectangular cloak that could be draped in countless ways. It was fashion's Swiss Army knife, blanket, shawl, scarf, toga substitute, you name it. Philosophers loved their hematia because the folds looked dramatic during lectures. Pictures Socrates pacing around in an oversized woolen wrap, making profound points while trying not to trip on the hem. And it wasn't just function, it was flair. How you draped your cloak could announce your status, your mood, even your political leanings. Loose and flowing, you're relaxed, maybe wealthy. Tight and short, you're practical, maybe a worker or a soldier. The art of drapery was a silent performance, a statement without words. And the fabric itself mattered. Wool for warmth, linen for summer, occasionally imported silk if you were fabulously rich and didn't mind being accused of Persian decadence. Speaking of silk, yes, some ancient Greeks did wear it, though it came from far, far away through the early trade routes with the mysterious East. For most Greeks, it was like talking about spaceships today, beautiful, rare, and almost mythical. Only the ultra-rich could afford it, and philosophers despised it. To them, silk was the ultimate symbol of weakness, luxury, and moral decay. A man in silk was practically confessing that he'd gone soft. One Athenian comic playwright even joked that silk wearers were half men, half butterflies. Now hygiene, because wearing the same linen tunic in the desert heat all day isn't exactly glamorous. Egyptians were remarkably clean compared to many other ancient cultures. They bathed daily, sometimes multiple times, and used perfumed oils instead of soap. Even common laborers tried to wash off the day's sweat in the Nile or a nearby basin. Clean linen wasn't just pleasant, it was a moral good. Dirty clothing meant disorder, and disorder meant you were slipping out of favor with Maat, the divine balance of the world. So yes, laundry was practically a spiritual exercise. Greek cleanliness was a bit more philosophical, literally. Public baths weren't as common as in later Roman times, but Greeks did enjoy washing at fountains or gymnasiums. The gym, by the way, was where men exercised naked, because the word gymnasium comes from gymnos, meaning nude. After working up a sweat, they'd scrape oil and dirt off their skin with a metal tool called a strigil. And yes, they oiled themselves before exercising. Ancient self-care was basically oil up, show off, then scrape down. Even in their simplicity, these habits tell us something profound. Both Egyptians and Greeks saw clothing and cleanliness as extensions of the soul. You didn't just wear your tunic, you inhabit it. Your clothes carried your scent, your sweat, your status, and your identity. A stain wasn't just dirt, it was a story. A tear wasn't merely wear and tear, it was evidence of work, battle, or life. And through all this, one thing stayed constant: the human desire to balance function and form. Whether through the flowing linens of Egypt or the layered wool of Greece, people found ways to adapt beauty to necessity. They turned comfort into art, survival into style, and even without modern branding or fashion shows, they managed to create cultures where what you wore could say everything about who you were, without ever saying a word. But while garments kept people alive and dignified, they also became boundaries, markers of class, purity, and gender. And as history kept weaving forward, those threads of identity would tighten, pulling society into even more complex patterns of who could wear what, when, and why. Let's pull at that thread of social identity for a moment, because in both Egypt and Greece, clothing didn't just cover you, it defined you. Before you even opened your mouth, your garments had already introduced you, judged you, and possibly sentenced you. What you wore told the world your class, your job, your gender, your morality, and sometimes even your destiny. And heaven help you if you wore something that didn't match your station. Ancient societies didn't like fashion rebels. In Egypt, the visual hierarchy was practically written in linen. The poorest farmers wore the simplest loincloths, basically a rectangle of fabric tied around the waist. No frills, no dye, just function. Artisans and merchants might wear short tunics, sometimes with shoulder straps, maybe even a sash if they were feeling fancy. But nobility, that's where things got theatrical. Fine pleated linen skirts, intricate bead collars, gold bracelets, perfumed wigs, every detail announced wealth and power. Some nobles even wore fake beards as a mark of status, because facial hair was a royal privilege. Imagine being so powerful that you could make pretend beards a trend. And then there were the priests. Theirs was a whole different aesthetic. Clean, white, minimalist. Their linen was the purest of the pure, their bodies shaven, their clothes changed multiple times a day. It wasn't about vanity. It was about ritual. The gods demanded cleanliness, and the priests delivered it, one bath and linen swab at a time. You could smell a temple official from across the courtyard. Frankincense, lotus oil, and the faint aroma of sanctity. And somewhere nearby, a servant was boiling yet another batch of linen for tomorrow's ceremonies. But even within that hierarchy, fashion had its politics. Pharaohs didn't just wear fancy clothes because they liked them. They wore them to become gods. Their crowns, scepters, and ceremonial kilts were visual declarations of divine order. Every pattern and ornament was symbolic. The blue crown for battle, the Nemes headdress for authority, the Urius cobra for divine protection. The garments weren't mere fabric. They were sacred technology, wrapping mortal flesh in the illusion of immortality. And when a new dynasty took power, fashion changed too. A new pharaoh might favor tighter pleats or different jewelry styles, subtly signaling the dawn of a new era. Think of it as ancient state-sponsored rebranding. Now in Greece, things were no less coded, but a little more democratic, at least in theory. Greeks prided themselves on simplicity. In fact, they mocked the Persians for their extravagance and the Egyptians for their rigidity. The ideal Greek citizen was supposed to dress modestly, but tastefully. No glitter, no perfume overload, no outrageous colors. A clean, well-folded chiton was a badge of self-discipline. You didn't need jewels to look good. You just needed virtue, posture, and a bit of sunlight. But simple was relative. Wealth still showed, just in subtler ways. Finer wool, cleaner whites, softer dyes, all signaled that you weren't toiling in the fields. Even the way a cloak draped could betray your status. A rich man could afford fabric long enough to wrap in dramatic folds. A poor man's himation was shorter, simpler, and often patched. And women? They had to navigate an even more intricate code. Greek women's fashion was all about modesty, but not the kind that erased beauty. It emphasized restraint. A respectable Athenian woman wouldn't dare go out in public without her peplos or chiton, properly pinned and belted, and often layered with a veil. The veil wasn't just decoration. It was social armor, a sign that she belonged to a man and wasn't for public admiration. Ironically, this modesty only applied to citizen women. Courtesans and entertainers, the attire, were free to dress in brighter colors, softer fabrics, and revealing styles. Their allure wasn't scandalous, it was their profession. And so women's clothing became a visual map of morality, where the difference between virtue and vice might be the placement of a pin or the looseness of a belt. Then came the warriors. Greek soldiers, the hoplites, had their own brutal form of fashion. Bronze, leather, and sweat. Their tunics were short for mobility, their cloaks crimson to mask blood, and their helmets, well, those were statement pieces. Nothing said, "Don't mess with me," like a horsehair crest catching sun. The famous Spartan cloak, the Tunics, was so symbolic of discipline and fearlessness that other Greeks both admired and dreaded it. To the Spartans, red meant courage, blood, and unity. To everyone else, it meant you were probably about to be conquered. And while Greek men strutted in the agora, discussing virtue, Greek slaves were the silent background color of society, often literally dressed in drab, undyed fabric. Their clothing was purely functional, rough wool or coarse linen, whatever kept them alive while they labored. No adornments, no choice. The texture of their fabric reflected their position in the social weave, necessary but invisible. And yet, sometimes these same slaves were the ones who dressed the rich, washed their garments, and perfumed their oils. The irony was staggering. The poorest hands maintained the appearance of the highest. It's fascinating how both civilizations turned clothing into a form of social choreography. Every fold, color, and accessory carried meaning, and stepping out of that pattern was risky. A Greek man dressing too extravagantly might be accused of effeminacy. An Egyptian commoner wearing priestly white could be punished for hubris. Fashion was both expression and confinement, a dance between individuality and obedience. And yet, humans being humans, rules were made to be bent. Archaeological findings reveal workers buried with jewelry, servants depicted in art wearing slightly finer garments than they should, and women experimenting with hairstyles that pushed boundaries. These small acts of defiance hint at a universal truth. No matter how strict the rules, people always find ways to express themselves. A brighter sash here, a daring pin there, tiny rebellions woven into the fabric of conformity. Because even in a world defined by hierarchy and symbolism, people still wanted to look good. They still wanted to feel seen. Fashion, after all, wasn't just about class. It was about being human. But that desire for identity through clothing didn't stop at appearance. It extended to ritual, to life, to death itself. Because what you wore in your final moments, or what others dressed you in afterward, could define your eternity. And in both Egypt and Greece, death had a dress code too. Death in the ancient world was never just an ending, it was a performance, and like any good performance, you had to be dressed for the part, because whether you believed in the field of reeds or the underworld of Hades, no one wanted to arrive looking like they'd slept through their own funeral. Clothing for the afterlife wasn't just symbolic, it was spiritual insurance, and both the Egyptians and the Greeks took it very seriously. In Egypt, preparing for death was almost a lifelong hobby. The elite planned their tombs, commissioned their coffins, and selected their burial clothes long before their final breath. The linen that wrapped their bodies wasn't random, it was sacred. Every strip was woven, washed, and sometimes inscribed with protective spells from the Book of the Dead. Priests performed purification rituals as they wrapped the body, layer upon layer, transforming flesh into something eternal. What started as cloth became armor against decay, demons, and the judgment of Osiris himself. And for the Egyptians, the quality of your linen in death reflected the quality of your life. Pharaohs were swaddled in hundreds of meters of the finest, thinnest linen, fabric so sheer it could flutter with a whisper, yet so pure it was believed to repel evil. Commoners, meanwhile, made do with coarser bands, often reusing old household linens. Yes, recycling was a thing even in the afterlife economy. But regardless of rank, the ritual was universal. Clean body, clean cloth, clean soul. Death was not a surrender. It was an ascension, and linen was the ladder. Even beyond the wrappings, Egyptian funerary fashion was a whole aesthetic. Amulets shaped like scarabs, ankhs, and eyes of Horus were tucked between layers for protection. Jewelry, wigs, cosmetics, all made appearances in tombs, because eternity required good presentation. And it wasn't Manany, it was theology. The gods were perfect beings, radiant and orderly. To face them disheveled or unadorned would have been like showing up to a royal banquet in a potato sack. Yet there's a haunting realism to it all. In many tomb paintings, servants are shown dressing the deceased or preparing fine garments, immortalizing an act of care that bridged the worlds of the living and the dead. The message was clear. The same people who clothed you in life would prepare you for eternity. It was one last gesture of humanity before the linen doors closed forever. Greece, on the other hand, approached death with more restraint, but no less symbolism. A Greek funeral was as much about ritual purity as it was about mourning. The body was washed, anointed with oil, and dressed in clean white garments, usually a simple chiton. White wasn't chosen for beauty, but for purity, a blank canvas symbolizing the soul's release. For the Greeks, the afterlife wasn't about luxury, it was about dignity. But even in simplicity there was meaning. The dead were often wrapped in a winding sheet, much like the Egyptians, though without the complex layering. The fabric used was usually fine wool or linen, depending on the family's means. The women of the household, mothers, sisters, daughters, performed the washing and dressing, singing laments as they worked. Their wails echoed through the home, part grief, part ritual. Death was women's work, just as birth had been. And then came the grave goods, the quiet conversation between fashion and faith. Jewelry, hair ornaments, and clothing pins were sometimes buried with women. Soldiers might be interred with their armor, cloaks, or helmets. Even coins placed in the mouth or hand weren't just currency. They were part of the outfit, payment for Charon, the ferryman of souls. Because, apparently, even the dead needed pocket change for public transport. The fascinating thing about both Egyptian and Greek burial clothing is how personal it was. These garments weren't chosen by chance. They reflected the essence of the person. A beloved robe, a favorite necklace, a symbol of status or faith. The dead were dressed not just as they were, but as they wanted to be remembered. Death was fashion's final act of defiance against oblivion. And while Egyptians prepared to live forever in the light of Ra, Greeks faced an underworld that was dim, quiet, and endless. Their clothing was practical, a final comfort, a last touch of humanity before stepping into shadow. But both civilizations agreed on one thing: dignity must never die. Now, here's a curious twist. Both cultures also believed that improper clothing in death could have spiritual consequences. In Egypt, a poorly wrapped body risked eternal unrest. In Greece, failing to cover the dead correctly could offend the gods or doom the soul to wander. Clothing, once again, became cosmic etiquette. But beneath the rituals and superstitions lay something deeply human: the fear of being forgotten. The linen wrappings, the perfumed oils, the careful folds of fabric. They were love made visible, grief made tangible. To dress the dead was to say, you mattered. You still matter. And as centuries passed, even as empires rose and fell, this instinct, the need to clothe the departed with meaning, never faded. It evolved. In the hands of later generations, garments became relics, shrouds became symbols, and fashion crossed into faith itself. Because somewhere along the line, humans realized something extraordinary. The same fabric that shielded them from the sun could also shield their souls from the dark. So, as much as we talk about linen tunics and sandals, this was the deeper truth. Clothing wasn't just protection against nature, it was protection against oblivion. A thread connecting the living to the dead, the mortal to the divine, and that thread, once woven, never really unraveled. Now that we've seen how the ancients prepared for eternity, let's rewind back to the living and look at something a little more down to earth, how people actually felt in their clothes. Because while tomb paintings and statues make everyone look serene and noble, reality was far sweatier, itchier, and occasionally embarrassing. Imagine the midday sun hammering down on an Egyptian worker, sweat soaking through linen so thin it clung like a second skin. Ancient elegance? Not quite. More like a daily battle between human biology and the laws of physics. Linen, for all its divine associations, wasn't always comfortable. Sure, it was light, breathable, and sacred to the sun god Ra, but it also crinkled faster than paper and had a rough texture unless you could afford the finest weave. The elite could commission linen so sheer it was almost scandalous. Think ancient couture runway. But common folks wore fabric closer to sackcloth. And laundry? That was an ordeal. Egyptians pounded clothes against rocks or soaked them in lye, which, spoiler alert, isn't great for sensitive skin. People must have smelled like a mix of river mud, body oil, and whatever incense they could afford to mask it. Greeks, meanwhile, had their own version of fabric woes. Their garments, mostly made of wool, were heavier and warmer, perfect for chilly nights, but borderline torture under the Mediterranean sun. Wool itched. It stank when wet, and if you weren't wealthy enough to import fine linen from Egypt, you just had to grin and bear it, or more likely, scratch and complain. Yet somehow, out of these simple materials, they created silhouettes so graceful that artists spent centuries trying to imitate them. Drapery wasn't just practical, it was architectural. The folds of a Greek himation could rival the columns of the Parthenon in precision. But beyond comfort and style, clothes had to survive the daily grind. Farmers, fishermen, soldiers, all wore garments that took a beating. Egyptian peasants often worked barefoot, their linen skirts hitched high for mobility. Dust, sand, and sweat were constant companions. The sun bleached their tunics and burned their shoulders, but the alternative, going naked, wasn't entirely unheard of either. For tasks like harvesting or construction, modesty sometimes took a back seat to practicality. It was a world where function often beat fashion, even if that meant a little exposure. Greek workers faced similar realities. Their chitons were hitched up or belted tight for labor. transforming flowing robes into makeshift shorts. Slaves and poor citizens might own only one garment at a time, worn day and night until it frayed into rags. Laundry was a communal task involving cold water, ash soap, and plenty of scrubbing. And while Greek statues make everyone look like they had endless wardrobes of pristine white cloth, in truth, most people were recycling, repairing, or repurposing whatever they could. Holes were patched, hems were shortened, stains were lived with. Fast fashion? Try forever fashion. And here's something we rarely think about. Clothing wasn't private. Without modern bathrooms, changing rooms, or bedrooms, people often dressed and undressed in shared spaces. Bathhouses, courtyards, or even doorways doubled as makeshift closets. Children ran around half naked. Men worked shirtless. Women adjusted tunics in public. The body wasn't as hidden or taboo as it later became. A bit of shoulder here and exposed leg there. It was just life. Of course, context mattered. A slave showing too much might be punished. A noblewoman revealing her arm could cause scandal. But generally, the ancient world was less prudish and more practical than we imagine. Footwear followed the same logic. Sandals were a luxury for many. Going barefoot was normal. Egyptian streets weren't paved, and Greek paths were rocky, so feet got tough, literally. People developed calluses so thick they probably could have stepped on a seashell without flinching. And sandals weren't the soft, comfy kind either. They were made from reeds, palm fibers, or raw leather that rubbed blisters until it molded to your foot. Comfort came through endurance, not design. But what fascinates historians today is how much pride people still took in appearance, despite those rough realities. A farmer might wash his only tunic before a festival, starch it with natron to make it crisp, and walk taller because of it. A Greek woman might save up for a bit of imported linen, dye it saffron yellow, and wear it as a mark of modest luxury. Fashion was self-expression long before catwalks and hashtags. It was a statement of worth, identity, and sometimes rebellion. In Athens, for instance, sumptuary laws occasionally tried to curb excess. Women were warned against wearing too much gold or flaunting imported fabrics. But human nature being what it is, people always found loopholes. Subtle embroidery, artful drapery, even perfume. Status found ways to shine through. Egypt had similar social codes. The lower classes weren't forbidden from dressing well, but their reality simply didn't allow it. Still, even the humblest villager might adorn themselves with a shell necklace or a painted bead to feel beautiful for a day. It's easy to laugh now, imagining a civilization obsessed with linen wrinkles or sandal straps. But that's what makes ancient fashion so compelling. It wasn't trivial. It was identity armor. Every fold, every weave, every stitch told the world who you were and where you belonged. The pharaoh's pleated kilt wasn't just about style. It was a uniform of divinity. A Greek philosopher's unbelted himation declared his detachment from wealth. Clothing was language, and everyone, rich or poor, spoke it fluently. And underneath it all, the same constant hum remained. The feel of fabric against skin, the fight against heat and dust, the quiet satisfaction of looking in a polished bronze mirror and seeing yourself reflected back as something more than just flesh and bone. Because whether you were an Egyptian scribe or a Greek farmer, to dress was to exist. To feel the world press against your skin and say, yes, you belong here, among the living, for now. But what did people actually think about their clothes? Not in a "does this make me look fat" kind of way, but philosophically, spiritually even. Because in both Egypt and Greece, fashion wasn't just about keeping up appearances. It was about aligning yourself with cosmic order. The ancients didn't wear clothes just because it was polite. They wore them to exist correctly within the universe. Take Egypt. Everything there revolved around Ma'at, the principle of balance, truth, and harmony. To be dressed properly was to participate in that harmony. Clean linen, fresh from the river, and sun-dried on the bank symbolized purity and divine favor. Priests changed their garments multiple times a day during rituals, not because they were vain, but because the gods demanded cleanliness as a spiritual offering. A speck of dust or a stain wasn't just unsightly, it was impure. It disrupted cosmic order. Imagine if every laundry day were also a religious ceremony. That's basically Egypt. For ordinary Egyptians, wearing white linen wasn't just practical. It was aspirational. It connected them, however faintly, to the divine. And the act of washing clothes in the Nile, that endless artery of life, was itself sacred. There's poetry in it. The same water that fed your crops and carried your God's reflection also purified your garments. You didn't just look clean, you were clean in body and spirit. Greeks, meanwhile, had a more intellectual relationship with clothing. The philosopher's robe wasn't merely comfort wear, it was a declaration. The unadorned himaiton of a thinker said, "I am above vanity. I dress for reason, not riches." The Stoics, in particular, took pride in simplicity. They believed that to adorn yourself excessively was to advertise your ignorance. Luxury made you a slave to opinion. The truly wise, they argued, needed no jewelry to shine, just a clean conscience, and maybe a good sandal. But don't let that fool you into thinking the Greeks were all minimalists. Far from it. Outside the symposiums and lecture halls, they adored fashion. The rich draped themselves in imported linens from Egypt and dyed them in costly purples or yellows. Athenian women competed in elegance during festivals, their garments flowing like liquid light under the sun. Even hairstyles became statements. Curls were sculpted, oiled, and perfumed to perfection. Vanity might have been frowned upon in philosophy, but in daily life it was practically an Olympic sport. Still, there was a moral thread woven through it all: modesty. In both cultures, clothing expressed virtue as much as status. An Egyptian woman's sheath dress hugged the body but wasn't considered indecent. It revealed form without shame because beauty was divine. The Greeks held a similar view. Beauty, kalos, and goodness, agathos, were linked. To appear graceful, balanced, well-dressed, that was to honor the gods. Sloppiness, by contrast, was almost a sin. It reflected inner disorder, laziness of spirit. A wrinkled chiton could hint at a wrinkled soul. And yet irony abounded. The same society that idealized modesty also celebrated athletic nudity. At Greek gymnasia, men trained completely unclothed. Gymnos literally means naked. Why? Because they believed the human form was the ultimate expression of divine design. To see a well-trained body in motion was to glimpse harmony itself. So, in a weird twist, a culture obsessed with the dignity of clothing also elevated the total absence of it to an art form. Go figure. Egypt, for its part, didn't glorify nudity in the same way, but it wasn't scandalized by it either. Children often went naked until puberty. Laborers stripped down to the essentials under the relentless sun. Modesty wasn't about covering up. It was about context. A temple demanded decorum. The field demanded freedom. As long as the balance of Ma'at was kept, no one raised an eyebrow. What's fascinating is how both civilizations used clothing as a moral mirror. Your attire could reveal your piety, your education, your restraint, or your decadence. When Greek playwrights mocked the new money aristocrats, they targeted their flamboyant robes. When Egyptian scribes described corrupt officials, they often depicted them in unkempt or disheveled dress. Disorder in fabric equaled disorder in soul. And yet, for all their moralizing, both societies adored the spectacle of wealth. In Athens, festivals were parades of color, texture, and perfume. The Panathenaic procession saw citizens dressed in their finest, carrying new robes, peplos, to clothe the statue of Athena herself. Imagine gifting your city's patron goddess a new outfit every year. That's civic devotion with style. In Egypt, the temples of Karnak and Luxor hosted grand processions where priests, nobles, and pharaohs displayed layers of dazzling linen, gold collars, and perfumed wigs. The air shimmered with myrrh and incense. Sunlight bounced off polished jewelry like divine fire. To witness, it must have been breathtaking, a fashion show for the gods themselves. And through all that spectacle, a quiet truth persisted. Clothing was never just fabric. It was faith, status, and psychology stitched together. Every hem, every fold, every scent carried meaning. When an Egyptian tied on a sash or a Greek adjusted a fold of their kitten, they weren't just getting dressed, they were affirming their place in the world. But as empires rose and fell, as trade routes tangled and cultural borders blurred, these meanings began to shift. Fabrics crossed seas, dyes changed hands, and with them came new ideas of beauty, identity, and power. The linen of Egypt met the wool of Greece, and from that fusion, a more connected, ancient world began to take shape, one draped not just in fabric, but in exchange, imitation, and innovation. And soon enough, fashion would become something even bigger than religion or status. It would become politics. Politics and fabric, two things humans have always managed to tangle together. You might think a tunic is just a tunic, but in ancient Egypt and Greece, what you wore could declare allegiance, rebellion, or divine right faster than any speech ever could. Clothing wasn't just personal, it was propaganda. Let's start with Egypt, where every thread on a pharaoh's body screamed legitimacy. Royal garments weren't random, they were sacred code. The pleated linen kilt of the king wasn't just about elegance, it symbolized Ma'at, that eternal balance of order and justice. And that shimmering gold-threaded sash, that wasn't bling, it was power made visible. Pharaohs often wore false beards and elaborate crowns, but it was the fabric, the purity and perfection of their linen that reflected divine favor. If your linen gleamed white as sunlight, you were literally radiating divinity. The people believed the gods themselves approved your laundry. Even color, rare as it was, carried weight. True white linen was a royal luxury because bleaching required precious resources. Only the wealthy could afford pure, luminous garments. Lower classes wore off-white or beige, naturally tinted by the fibers themselves. But during festivals or coronations, the visual contrast between the radiant pharaoh and the dusty crowd wasn't just aesthetic, it was psychological warfare. The ruler's perfection reminded everyone exactly who kept chaos at bay. The priesthood took notes. In temples, they wore spotless linen robes as symbols of purity, their clothing meticulously maintained and replaced. And make no mistake, this wasn't just piety, it was politics wrapped in ritual. To be clean was to be legitimate. The dirtiest accusation you could make wasn't about corruption or greed, it was about spiritual impurity. A priest caught wearing soiled robes might as well have confessed to heresy. Meanwhile, in Greece, politics played out in a more democratic, but no less fashionable arena. The philosopher's robe, the soldier's cloak, the citizen's chiton, all carried civic identity like modern-day uniforms. The city-state you belonged to could often be read in the cut, color, or drape of your garment. Spartans, for instance, were notorious for simplicity. Their cloak, the phoenikes, was dyed deep crimson, symbolizing courage and masking blood. It was practical and intimidating, a perfect summary of Spartan philosophy. No frills, just fear. Athenians, on the other hand, embraced elegance. Their democracy demanded visibility. Citizens appeared in public assemblies, courts, and theaters, and their clothing reflected civic pride. The himation, draped with artful precision, became a symbol of thoughtful citizenship. Wearing it correctly showed refinement, discipline, and respect for tradition. Sloppiness, even in drapery, could be read as moral weakness. It wasn't just about fashion, it was about fitness for democracy. But the Greeks also knew how to weaponize appearance. Athenian politicians often adopted humble clothing to appear relatable to the masses. It was performative modesty, an ancient version of "I am just like you" photo ops. Meanwhile, in times of war or crisis, generals might don their armor or crimson cloaks during assemblies to project strength. The same fabric that shaded them from the sun could suddenly become a tool of persuasion. Then there were the women, whose clothing often reflected their exclusion from politics, but also their subtle influence within it. In Athens, respectable women were expected to wear modest, layered garments in veils, signaling chastity and domestic virtue. Yet the wives and daughters of powerful men used fabric as their quiet rebellion. Fine dyes, delicate embroidery, imported textiles, these weren't just luxuries, they were statements. They whispered, "My household has wealth, education, and taste." In a society where women couldn't vote, their garments still carried weight in shaping public image. Egyptian women, particularly in elite circles, wielded similar soft power through style. Queens like Nefertari and Nefertiti turned dress into diplomacy. Their clothing blended divine imagery with political theater. A transparent linen gown paired with heavy gold jewelry and the blue crown of authority wasn't vanity, it was statecraft. To appear divine was to command loyalty. To shimmer under the desert sun was to remind the world that you were both woman and goddess, mortal and myth. Even soldiers, the supposed antithesis of fashion, became part of the political spectacle. Egyptian guards wore kilts with decorative pleats and belts embossed with royal insignia, transforming the battlefield into a moving billboard for Pharaoh's glory. Greek hoplites, wrapped in crimson cloaks or crested helmets, marched in synchronized unity that was as much about intimidation as aesthetics. The line between function and propaganda blurred until it vanished entirely. And then came the festivals, the great public fashion stages of the ancient world. In Egypt, the festival of Opet in Thebes saw the pharaoh paraded through the streets in dazzling ceremonial linen, surrounded by priests, musicians, and perfumed dancers. Every fold of fabric caught the light. Every pleat proclaimed divine favor. it wasn't just celebration, it was renewal of cosmic authority, woven right into the wardrobe. In Athens, the Panathenaic festival served a similar purpose. The city gathered to offer a new robe to Athena, its protector goddess. But it wasn't just about gifting a deity some fresh linen. It was a declaration that Athens itself was united, prosperous, and pious. The robe, woven by women of the city, was a textile constitution, proof that civic virtue and craftsmanship went hand in hand. Through all of this, clothing became the ultimate social script. To dress correctly was to belong. To misdress was rebellion. And when rebellion did come, whether through class tensions, shifting empires, or philosophical revolutions, it often started not with words, but with fabric. In time, the Greeks began to question whether appearances truly defined virtue, while the Egyptians doubled down, preserving their visual traditions even as foreign powers encroached. The contrast between these two worlds, one clinging to sacred formality, the other experimenting with self-expression, would set the stage for something entirely new, because as trade expanded and conquerors crossed seas, fashion itself began to travel faster than armies. Soon, Egyptian linen and Greek wool would mingle with Persian silks, Phoenician dyes, and Eastern embroidery, and the result? A melting pot of identity, luxury, and cultural exchange that would redefine what it meant to look civilized. Trade did what conquerors alone never could. It connected wardrobes. Somewhere between the Nile Delta and the Aegean coast, ships packed with bolts of fabric, bundles of dye, and crates of jewelry began to change how people saw themselves. The late Bronze Age was basically the dawn of globalization, except instead of smartphones and fast food, it was linen, wool, and the irresistible shimmer of imported color. Egyptian linen was the stuff of legend. Everyone wanted it. The Greeks, the Phoenicians, the Hittites, they all paid handsomely for cloth that was smooth, cool, and almost ethereal. It was said that the best Egyptian linen could be folded into the size of a walnut without creasing, so light that it fluttered with your heartbeat. Greek traders brought home not just the fabric, but the idea of what it represented: purity, luxury, divine favor. Soon, Greek elites began wearing lighter, finer chittons modeled after Egyptian weaving styles. The fashion wave had begun. Meanwhile, the Egyptians, always observant, started adopting little hints of foreign flair. From the Aegean came decorative patterns, intricate borders, and colored threads that broke up the monotony of pure white linen. Gold thread embroidery became popular among the elite, and new jewelry styles appeared: spiral bracelets, filigree earrings, and gemstone inlays borrowed from Mycenaean and Minoan artisans. The ancient world wasn't static. It was a creative remix. And then came the dyes. Oh, the dyes! Before the synthetic age, color was chemistry, craft, and conquest all in one. Purple, the most coveted of them all, was literally worth its weight in silver. It came from the glands of a sea snail, the murex, and required thousands of them to make a single garment. Only the richest Greeks or Egyptian nobles could afford it. And when they did, they flaunted it. A robe tinged with purple wasn't just fashion, it was status, dripping from your shoulders. The Egyptians, who generally preferred white for spiritual reasons, began introducing subtle tinted linens, light yellows, soft pinks, pale blues, that hinted at color without defying ritual purity. Trade didn't just spread fabric, it spread ideas of beauty, hygiene, and self-presentation. Greek philosophers visiting Egypt wrote admiringly about the Egyptians' cleanliness, their ritual baths, and their simple, elegant dress. Meanwhile, Egyptian artisans took note of the Greek obsession with form and proportion. Statues began to shift, and their drapery rendered with new fluidity. Art imitated fashion, and fashion, in turn, reflected art. The two civilizations began influencing each other not through war, but through aesthetics. But not everyone was thrilled by this cultural crossover. Traditionalists in both lands grumbled that foreign fashions were corrupting moral values. Egyptian scribes mocked young nobles for abandoning sober linen for soft fabrics from across the sea. Greek philosophers complained that men were losing their virtues, too concerned with perfumed oils and imported robes. It was the ancient version of kids these days, complete with moral panic over hem lengths and foreign trends. Yet, just as today, outrage couldn't stop curiosity. And those perfumes, those were another trade miracle. The Egyptians had long perfected the art of fragrance, blending lotus, myrrh, cinnamon, and frankincense into oils that doubled as deodorant and divine offering. When the Greeks got their hands on them, they were hooked. Temples, theaters, and banquets began to smell like an Alexandrian garden in bloom. The word aroma itself came to mean both pleasure and power. To smell good wasn't vanity, it was civilization. But perhaps the most profound shift that trade brought was how people viewed fabric itself. Once it had been purely functional, something to protect against sun or cold. Now it became narrative. A tunic could tell where you came from, who you traded with, how much you owned, and even what gods you prayed to. The world was becoming interconnected, and fashion was its most visible proof. Think of it this way. When a Greek citizen in Athens wore a fine Egyptian linen chiton, dyed with Phoenician purple, and clasped with a bronze pin made in Anatolia, he was literally wearing globalization. His clothing was a map, a resume, and a social statement, all in one. Egypt, for its part, absorbed the world while still holding fast to its core. Even as Libyan, Assyrian, and Persian influences arrived, the white linen of Ma'at persisted like a thread holding the culture together through centuries of change. Yet beneath the luxury and cultural exchange, something quieter was happening. Commoners, workers, slaves, farmers were the ones who wove these fabrics, dyed the threads, carried the bolts through desert ports, and tanned the hides for sandals that nobles would never touch. Fashion had always been a hierarchy, but in this interconnected world, the gap between maker and wearer grew wider. The elite's beauty was built on invisible hands, the hands that spun in silence while others shone. And still, even among those workers, scraps of beauty survived. A fisherman's wife in Alexandria might adorn her simple dress with a bright border. A Greek shepherd might tie a dyed strip of cloth around his head to keep sweat from his eyes, but also because it looked good. The desire to decorate, to make meaning out of fabric, was universal. It belonged to no empire, no class. So as trade winds filled the sails between Memphis and Piraeus, the ancient world wasn't just exchanging goods. It was weaving a shared imagination. A linen thread from Egypt, a wool strand from Greece, a drop of Tyrian purple from Phoenicia, all twisted together into something that would outlast them all, because long after kings fell and temples crumbled, that fabric of ideas, of style, identity, and cross-cultural influence kept expanding. The world had learned something essential. What we wear doesn't just cover us, it connects us. By the time the late dynasties began their slow waltz into decline, Egypt had already dressed half the known world. But fashion, like history, has a way of looping back on itself. What was once a statement of divine order began to morph into something more personal, more experimental. The Greeks had taught the world about symmetry, but Egypt still had something the newcomers didn't: ritual. And in Egypt, even the way you tied your sash could be an act of faith. Let's start with the shift in silhouette. As new rulers and influences drifted in, Libyans, Nubians, Persians, and eventually the Macedonians under Alexander, Egyptian attire became a mirror of empire. The crisp, angular linen kilts of the Old Kingdom softened into flowing robes and layered garments. The nobles adopted wide, pleated mantles that draped around the shoulders like clouds. The once sharply defined lines of Egyptian dress gave way to fabrics that whispered more than they declared. Clothing began to blur the line between genders. Men in wide-sleeved robes, women in high-waisted tunics, both cinched with elaborate sashes or belts in gold and dyed linen. And then came the Hellenistic wave, the fashion equivalent of a cultural thunderclap. The Ptolemaic dynasty, founded by a Macedonian general with a love for Greek aesthetics, transformed Egypt's cities into fashion laboratories. Alexandria, especially, became a catwalk before catwalks existed. Imagine streets lined with perfumeries, textile merchants, and jewelry stalls glowing under the Mediterranean sun. Every corner smelled like honeyed resin and sandalwood. The people, half Greek, half Egyptian, all ambitious, turned self-presentation into performance. Ptolemaic queens like Arsinoe II and Cleopatra VII understood this better than anyone. They weren't just rulers, they were visual events. Cleopatra, in particular, wielded fashion like a weapon. Every appearance was engineered to send a message: divinity, sophistication, danger. She blended Egyptian symbolism with Greek sensuality, a living embodiment of two worlds stitched into one. Her linen robes were translucent and scented, her gold collars heavy with serpentine motifs. Her headdresses shimmered with lapis lazuli and emeralds, the colors of the gods. But she could pivot in an instant, appearing before Caesar or Antony not as a goddess, but as Venus herself, in a flowing Greek peplos, crowned in pearls that later legends said she dissolved in wine just to prove a point. It was propaganda wrapped in silk, and it worked. Meanwhile, the average Egyptian watched this spectacle from the sidelines. For them, life and fashion was still practical. Linen remained the fabric of the people, but dyes and imported wool became more accessible. Commoners began to emulate elite styles in small ways. A pleated edge here, a colored border there, a necklace copied from a statue's adornment. For the first time, style trickled down. The hierarchies of the ancient world, once so rigid, started to fray, literally and metaphorically. Even religion bent toward aesthetic innovation. Priests continued to wear traditional linen robes, symbolizing purity, but their accessories became increasingly ornate. Gold thread embroidery and amulets depicting hybrid deities, a nod to Egypt's growing multiculturalism, appeared. The divine had gone cosmopolitan. The blending of Greek and Egyptian design also birthed something quietly revolutionary: comfort. The Greeks prized drape and flow, the Egyptians structure and purity. Together, they created garments that moved with the body rather than against it. For the first time, fashion wasn't just about status, it was about sensation. The feeling of air on skin, of perfume warming on fabric, of being seen not only as part of a hierarchy, but as an individual. Art followed suit. Statues of the Ptolemaic era depict figures whose garments cling with realism, folds cascading like waterfalls. Painters began highlighting texture and light. Even funerary portraits, the famous Fayum mummy portraits, showed Egyptians dressed in Greco-Roman fashions, wearing wreaths, earrings, and tunics that could have belonged to any citizen of the Mediterranean world. Death, once the final reaffirmation of Egyptian identity, now reflected a hybrid humanity. Yet, despite all this transformation, something ancient still pulsed beneath the surface. Linen, always linen, remained Egypt's signature. Even in a world of imported silks and dyed wool, the pure white cloth continued to represent the ideal of Ma'at: balance, truth, order. When Cleopatra died, likely wearing Greek attire, her body would still have been wrapped in Egyptian linen, the same way pharaohs had been for 3,000 years. No matter how the world changed, Egypt returned to its thread. The irony of it all, while fashion evolved from divine symbolism to personal expression, the same logic persisted. Clothing wasn't just decoration, it was declaration. What changed was who got to speak. In the Old Kingdom, only the gods and pharaohs could say something through dress. By the Ptolemaic era, even a merchant could express identity, aspiration, or allegiance through what they wore. In a way, Egypt's long journey through fabric mirrored humanity's, from ritual to selfhood, from order to individuality, from linen to luxury. And so, as the Nile carried its endless tide past temples and palaces now worn by time, the wind that once swelled the sails of trading ships now tugged at the robes of people who had learnt, through centuries of weaving, that fashion wasn't merely for the eye, it was for the soul. As Egypt's golden sands continued to shift beneath the weight of centuries, across the Aegean, another civilization was weaving its own legacy of linen, wool, and human vanity. Greece, sun-baked, sea-wrapped, and forever humming with the sound of sandals on marble, had a style philosophy that was both radically simple and maddeningly sophisticated. If Egypt dressed for the gods, Greece dressed for the world to see. And oh, did they love to be seen. Greek fashion began, as most things did, with practicality. The land was hot, the work was constant, and fabric was precious. Unlike Egypt, where linen was the undisputed king, the Greeks leaned toward wool, thicker, warmer, and easier to produce in their rocky, sheep-covered terrain. Linen existed too, but it was a luxury import from Egypt or the Near East. For when a Greek donned linen, it wasn't just for comfort. It was a flex, a statement that said, yes, I can afford the good stuff. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before the classical elegance of the Chiton and Himation, there was the rough and ready world of the Mycenaeans and Minoans. Picture frescoes of bare-chested athletes leaping over bulls, women in flounce skirts and open bodices that would make Victorian moralists faint dead away. Minoan fashion was vibrant and unapologetically sensual, clinging, patterned, colorful. Clothing wasn't modest, it was celebratory, a declaration of life, fertility, and confidence. Then came the collapse of that Bronze Age glitter, and the Greeks, now scattered and rebuilding, adopted a humbler aesthetic. Gone were the multi-layered gowns and tailored bodices. In their place came something radical in its restraint, the rectangle. Greek clothing became essentially a game of geometry. Take a large piece of fabric, linen or wool, fold, pin, drape, and boom, civilization. The result? The chiton for both men and women, and its cousin, the peplus. 2 rectangles, a few pins, and a rope for a belt, and somehow they created one of the most enduring silhouettes in human history. It sounds simple, but don't be fooled. The Greeks turned drapery into art. Each fold was calculated, each pin deliberate. The way fabric fell from shoulder to ankle wasn't random. It was philosophy made textile. Balance, they'd say, is beauty. Too much ornamentation was barbaric. Too little was neglectful. A proper Greek outfit moved with the body, revealing and concealing in perfect measure. It celebrated motion, proportion, and poise, the human form as architecture. And this is where the Greek genius shines. They treated fabric like light. It wasn't just about covering the body, it was about framing it. The chiton clung to the shoulders, flowed over the hips, and caught every breeze from the Aegean. Women's versions were often longer, with folds that cascaded like marble drapery in sculpture. Men wore shorter ones, tied at the waist or pinned on one shoulder, especially if they were soldiers, athletes, or, frankly, just didn't feel like overheating that day. The Greeks were also masters of minimalism, at least in theory. The colors? Often white or undyed, yes, but don't let that fool you. Wealthier citizens loved dye, saffron yellows, sea blues, crimson from crushed murex shells. Even the white garments were sometimes tinted with faint pastels or finished with embroidered borders. If Egypt worshipped the purity of linen, Greece worshipped the purity of the line. And let's talk about the accessories, because the Greeks didn't stop at fabric. Jewelry was abundant: gold, bronze, silver, decorated with glass beads or gemstones. But it wasn't worn for status alone. Each piece had symbolism: snakes for wisdom, owls for Athena's favor, leaves and vines for Dionysus's endless parties. A Greek woman's jewelry box was basically a portable mythology set. Footwear optional. The poorer citizens often went barefoot, their soles toughened by stone and sand. But sandals were everywhere, strapped leather that ranged from practical to ornate. Soldiers wore sturdier versions for the battlefield, while philosophers often chose to go without shoes altogether, part humility, part convenience. Imagine Socrates strolling through Athens, barefoot, delivering a lecture on virtue while dodging donkey droppings. That's Greek commitment. And hygiene, of course, was essential. The Greeks took bathing seriously, not in stagnant basins like the Egyptians, but in gymnasiums and public baths that doubled as social hubs. Olive oil was their soap, applied generously and scraped off with its strigil, leaving the skin clean, glistening, and perfumed. It was fashion meeting function. Smelling good was not just aesthetic, it was civic duty. By the classical age, fashion had become a language of intellect and identity. Philosophers favored simplicity, unbelted chitons, plain and unadorned, because excess suggested moral decay. Warriors and politicians, meanwhile, went for the statement pieces. Flowing cloaks, vibrant dyes, the occasional piece of armor polished to a blinding sheen. The himation, a heavy rectangular cloak, was the power move of the era. Draped over one shoulder, it could signal authority, virtue, or casual indifference, depending on how you wore it. Picture a senator addressing the assembly, cloak perfectly arranged, every fold an active theater. And that's the point. Greek clothing wasn't just functional, it was performance. How you walked, how the fabric moved, how much of your arm you revealed, all of it spoke volumes. Modesty and sensuality danced in constant tension, shaped by weather, wealth, and philosophy. For the Greeks, the body wasn't shameful, it was divine geometry. So while Egypt may have wrapped its people in linen to honor the gods, Greece wrapped its citizens in reason and rhythm. Their clothes, like their temples, sought perfection not through excess, but through proportion. And the result? A legacy of style so enduring that even today we still drape fabric on mannequins the way the ancients did on marble gods. And just when you think the Greeks couldn't make it more aesthetic, they added one more touch: perfume. Not just any scent, but handmade blends of olive oil, myrrh, and flowers from mountain slopes. Each city had its own aroma. Corinth smelled different from Athens, Athens from Sparta. Because in Greece, to be seen was divine, but to be remembered, you had to smell unforgettable. Now, let's linger a little longer among those Greek folds and fabrics, because fashion in ancient Greece wasn't just about style. It was social choreography. What you wore could announce where you stood in society, what mood you were in, and even what city you called home. A well-draped chiton was more than clothing. It was communication. Take the Athenian citizen, for example. In a world obsessed with order, democracy, and appearances, looking proper was a civic duty. The Athenian elite favored the finest fabrics, soft linen imported from Egypt, lightweight wool spun so delicately it practically whispered when it moved. But unlike the Egyptians, who prized uniform whiteness as a symbol of purity. The Greeks weren't afraid of color. Deep reds, indigos, and golden yellows, all drawn from natural dyes, made statements about wealth and refinement. A man's cloak could speak louder than his voice. If it was long, heavy, and impeccably folded, he was clearly a philosopher, poet, or politician. If short and loose, likely a craftsman, sailor, or someone perpetually late for something. And then there were the Spartans, the anti-Athens in almost every way. Theirs was a fashion of discipline, not display. Spartan men were infamous for their short, functional chitons, the kind that gave maximum leg freedom and minimum patience for vanity. They preferred red garments dyed with pigment from crushed insects, partly because it masked blood on the battlefield, and partly because, well, red just screamed confidence. Spartan women, too, were known to wear shorter tunics, scandalously so by Athenian standards. To the rest of Greece, this was shocking. To the Spartans, it was just logical. How else could you move freely if you were expected to train, wrestle, and run? This tension between restraint and flair defined Greek fashion. Even when simplicity reigned, the Greeks couldn't resist infusing beauty into utility. Take the pins, called fibulae, used to secure clothing. They weren't mere fasteners. They were jewelry, miniature skers in bronze, silver, or gold. Some were plain, but others were ornate, decorated with animal shapes or intricate designs. A woman might spend more time choosing her pins than her chiton, because those little glints of metal were her silent introduction before she even spoke. And speaking of women, their fashion world was an art form in itself. Women's chitons were longer, often reaching the floor, and could be layered or belted in multiple ways. Wealthier women had maidservants to assist with the daily ritual of dressing, ensuring every fold and drape achieved that effortless, goddess-like effect. And the hairstyles, oh, the hairstyles! Curls pinned with filigree, braids wrapped in ribbons, wreaths of fresh flowers for festivals. Athenian women weren't allowed to parade their independence publicly, but through hair and fabric, they whispered it anyway. Greek fashion also had a fascinating relationship with age and occasion. The young and athletic often went nearly naked, especially at the gymnasium, where oil and sweat were as common as gossip. Soldiers wore short tunics for mobility. Philosophers often went barefooted and cloaked in simplicity to emphasize intellect over appearance. Mourning attire, meanwhile, leaned toward darker tones, though true black was rare and symbolic of extremity. Weddings reversed that, pale, luminous fabrics, often perfumed, evoking purity and new beginnings. And always the drape, that meticulous, unspoken rule of proportion, Because beauty for the Greeks wasn't just in the object, it was in the symmetry between object and body. But the beauty wasn't only for the living. Even in death, the Greeks dressed with intention. Deceased women were often laid out in their finest garments, sometimes with jewelry, pins, and perfumed oils. Mourners would adorn the body with wreaths and shrouds, ensuring the soul departed in dignity. It wasn't about vanity, it was about continuity. Death was a journey, and you'd better look decent when meeting the gods. What's striking, though, is how democratic Greek fashion could be, at least in theory. Unlike in Egypt or later Rome, there weren't strict sumptuary laws restricting fabrics by class. True, the poor couldn't afford exotic dyes or imported linen, but the basic garment was the same shape for everyone. The difference lay in detail and drape, not in privilege of access. In other words, a beggar and a philosopher might technically be wearing the same thing. It was how they wore it that told the story. And maybe that's the most Greek thing of all, the belief that presentation reflected character. A crumpled chiton was a crumpled soul. A man who wore his himation badly might as well be uneducated. To dress well wasn't vanity, it was virtue. The harmony of folds, the logic of symmetry, the discipline of drape. All of it was philosophy stitched into fabric. Of course, not everyone cared about looking ideal. The laborers, fishermen, and farmers of rural Greece had their own simpler aesthetic. Shorter tunics, tougher wool, bare legs, and sand-covered feet. They needed clothes that moved, bent, and survived. These garments weren't sculptural. They were survival gear. Yet even there traces of Greek aesthetics lingered. The fabric might be coarse, but it still hung in deliberate lines. The belt might be just rope, but it cinched the waist with instinctive precision. Even the humblest farmer, hoeing his field under a merciless sun, was an accidental artist in motion. The Greeks managed to turn necessity into beauty, and beauty into philosophy. Their fashion was less about luxury and more about alignment, of fabric to body, of person to world. And perhaps that's why, centuries later, we still see the same aesthetic in our minds when we picture ancient elegance, bare feet on marble floors, linen catching the wind, gold glinting against bronzed skin. They made drapery immortal. And if Egypt had clothed humanity's spiritual awakening, Greece dressed its self-awareness. In the folds of those kittens and the sweep of those cloaks lived the first whispers of individuality, not divine order, not royal command, but human expression itself. By now, the Greek wardrobe had become something much larger than a collection of tunics and cloaks. It was a statement of civilization itself. But as the centuries rolled on, something curious began to happen. The purity of Greek aesthetics started blending with practicality, conquest, and cultural exchange. Just as Egypt had absorbed influences from its conquerors, so too did Greece, though it did so with characteristic flair. When Alexander the Great marched east, he didn't just spread empire, he spread fashion. Picture it. The young Macedonian king draped in a lightweight, sleeveless chiton that allowed free movement, riding across the burning plains of Persia. His soldiers, hardened by years of campaign, abandoned the heavy armor of their fathers in favor of simpler garments, shorter tunics, loose trousers borrowed from Eastern styles, and cloaks that could double as blankets. Function over form, but somehow still Greek. And that's the thing. Greek design was adaptable. Even when it met Persian silk or Indian cotton, it found a way to turn foreign materials into local philosophy. The Hellenistic age that followed Alexander's campaigns was a fashion renaissance. Suddenly, Greek cities from Egypt to Bactria were melting pots of texture and technique. Linen from the Nile, silk from the East, wool from the Aegean, all flowing together in ways that would have made earlier philosophers gasp. The Greeks had once mocked Persians for their lavishness, but now even the most stoic Athenian might find himself wrapped in imported silk, mumbling something about appreciating craftsmanship. Women's clothing, too, evolved. The traditional peplos gave way to more fluid, multi-layered styles inspired by the East. Fabrics became sheer, embroidered, and dyed in bold colors. Jewelry grew larger, more extravagant. The golden wreaths that once crowned the heads of priestesses now adorned aristocrats at banquets. The olive replaced by ivy, the modest by the magnificent. Even hairstyles grew elaborate, braided, coiled, perfumed, and pinned with foreign jewels. And perfume! Oh, the Greeks took scent seriously. The late Hellenistic world smelled like a perfumed breeze. Lilies from Cyrene, myrrh from Arabia, cinnamon from Ceylon. A well-dressed Greek woman of the 2nd century BCE might layer fragrance the way we layer clothing, base of oil, top of spice, finish of flower. It wasn't vanity, it was identity in aroma form. To smell good was to belong to the civilized world, to rise above the barbaric stench of unwashed humanity. Even men joined the olfactory arms race. Athletes perfumed themselves after competition. Philosophers dabbed oils before lectures. Lovers drenched themselves before banquets. The gymnasium smelled less like sweat and more like a garden after rain. It's ironic, really, these same people who wrote odes to moderation couldn't resist a little indulgence when it came to self-presentation. But beneath the aesthetics, fashion also began to reveal cracks in the Greek ideal. The simplicity that once defined the polis gave way to extravagance. In Athens and Alexandria alike, garments became status symbols. The more fabric you could afford, the better. Flowing robes and imported materials announced wealth as loudly as any speech. The old balance between beauty and restraint was slipping. The gods might have preached moderation, but the new elite worshipped spectacle. Still, Even as Hellenistic luxury blossomed, the essence of Greek design persisted: harmony, proportion, and the celebration of the human form. Artists captured it in stone, statues frozen in mid-motion, garments rippling like waves. You can almost feel the wind in the marble folds of a goddess's chiton. And that's because those folds weren't random. They were studied, mathematical, intentional. Greek sculptors didn't just carve fabric, they carved philosophy. Meanwhile, in the bustling markets of Athens or Rome, ordinary citizens lived their own version of that beauty. Tailors, weavers, and dyers worked in cramped workshops, churning out the fabrics that clothed the world. Linen from Egypt, wool from Thessaly, silk smuggled through trade routes, all found their way to Greek looms. The hum of weaving was as constant as the sea breeze. And while the elites debated virtue and decadence, these artisans were the quiet architects of style. And somewhere out on the dusty roads of Greece, farmers still trudged barefoot, their coarse wool tunics stiff with sweat and sun. Shepherds wrapped themselves in simple cloaks against the chill of mountain mornings. Fishermen tied belts made from rope and salt-stained cloth. They were worlds apart from the perfumed elites, yet bound by the same instinct to adorn, to define, to belong. Even their rough attire carried echoes of geometry and grace. This contrast between luxury and labor wasn't lost on the Greeks themselves. Philosophers wrote endlessly about it. Diogenes, the cynic, famously mocked the wealthy for fussing over their chitons while he lived in a barrel, wearing rags. Yet even his rebellion was a kind of statement. In rejecting Greek fashion, he proved its power. You can't scorn what doesn't matter, and perhaps that's the paradox of Greek fashion. It was born from simplicity, perfected through intellect, and corrupted by beauty. But it never lost its purpose. Even at its most extravagant, Greek dress remained about the body, its motion, its balance, its story. Whether woven from Egyptian linen or Persian silk, the goal was the same: to move through the world as gracefully as a god might, if gods still walked among men. By the time Rome began rising in the West, the Greek wardrobe had already conquered the imagination of the Mediterranean. The Romans might later claim to be innovators of style, but truthfully, they were inheritors. They borrowed the drape, the sandal, the jewelry, even the perfumes. What began on the sunlit stones of Athens would ripple outward for millennia. And as Greek statues stood gleaming in temples and villas, forever caught in mid-drape, they whispered a timeless truth. Fabric may fade, but form endures. When Rome finally rose to power, it didn't just inherit Greek art and philosophy, it raided their closets too. But before toga-clad senators began debating in marble halls, Greek fashion had already left an indelible mark on the ancient world. The draped silhouettes, the fluidity of fabric, the balance between comfort and beauty, all of it flowed naturally into Roman life. Yet, for the Greeks themselves, the late Hellenistic era was a strange kind of twilight, a time when the elegance of the past collided with the machinery of empire. Picture Athens under Roman rule. The temples still stood, the philosophers still lectured, and the tailors still worked their looms, but the tone had shifted. What once symbolized civic virtue and harmony now leaned toward personal display. Silk robes shimmered in the agora, imported from China through Byzantine traders, so delicate they almost defied gravity. Jewelry grew heavier, perfumes stronger. The Greek ideal of moderation was drowning in its own success. But even amid excess, the fundamentals remained. The average citizen still wore the same basic garments: the chiton, the himation, the peplos. What changed was how they were made, dyed, and accessorized. Linen, once the Egyptian hallmark, had fully integrated into Greek textile culture by now. It was cooler than wool, easier to drape, and far more comfortable for the long Mediterranean summers. Wealthy households even employed slaves solely to maintain their wardrobes, to wash, press, and scent the fabrics with oils before every outing. Imagine a culture so devoted to presentation that cleanliness became a kind of currency. And in Greek colonies far from the homeland, places like Antioch, Pergamon, and Cyrene, the blending of traditions created entire new aesthetics. Local fabrics, regional dyes, Eastern tailoring, all merged with Hellenic ideals. A Greek woman in Syria might wear a chiton cut slightly differently, with sleeves inspired by Persian robes. A merchant in Egypt might trade wool for papyrus and come home in a fine Egyptian kilt adapted to Greek proportions. Fashion was becoming globalized before the word even existed. Meanwhile, the philosophical tension between simplicity and luxury reached absurd heights. Stoics like Epictetus lectured that a wise man needed no ornamentation, only virtue. Yet, ironically, their students often attended these lectures wrapped in the most exquisitely folded cloaks money could buy. The gymnasium, once a place of athleticism and debate, now doubled as a stage for fashion rivalry. Young men strutted, hair oiled and curled, chitons perfectly belted to reveal muscular torsos. Modesty was out, the performance of beauty was in. Still, there were moments of pure humanity woven into the folds. Weddings in Hellenistic Greece, for instance, were kaleidoscopes of texture and color. The bride, veiled in gauzy linen, often wore a wreath of fresh myrtle or orange blossoms, her arms layered with gold bangles that jingled softly as she moved. Her perfume, perhaps spikenard or rose, was chosen days in advance, believed to please Aphrodite herself. Guests brought gifts of fine fabric, not jewels, because giving cloth was like giving life, something warm, useful, and intimate. Funerals, by contrast, reminded everyone that fashion could follow you into eternity. Families dressed their dead in clean white garments, simple and unadorned, before laying them on biers surrounded by offerings of oil and flowers. In some regions, mourners cut locks of their hair or tore their clothing, acts of visible grief that turned personal loss into a communal spectacle. Even death had its dress code. And then came the spectacle of the theater, the place where Greek fashion became performance incarnate. Actors wore masks, yes, but their costumes told entire stories through fabric alone. Kings in layered chitons of royal purple, peasants in coarse wool, gods shimmering in gold-threaded robes. The audience might have come for the play, but they stayed for the pageantry. For many, this was the only place they could glimpse colors and textures they'd never afford to wear themselves. Theater was fashion for the masses, a fantasy draped in linen and illusion. Meanwhile, artisans, those invisible hands behind every masterpiece, continued to define Greek fashion's fate. They dyed wool with madder root and saffron, pounded linen smooth with stone mallets, and spun thread so fine it could pass through a ring. The work was grueling, the rewards modest, but their craft held the civilization together. Without them, there would be no gleaming philosophers, no perfumed queens, no marble muses. Every great civilization is, after all, woven by the calloused hands of the unseen. As trade routes expanded, so too did the palette of Greek clothing. From India came cotton, a fabric lighter than any linen, quickly adopted for undergarments and fine tunics. From Africa came indigo, producing the deep blues that only the wealthy could afford. From Gaul and Iberia came wools dyed in strange northern hues, moss green, smoky gray, even crimson, so rich it rivaled the Phoenician purple. The Greeks, ever the curators of culture, turned all these imports into symbols of taste and intellect. But with this abundance came irony. The same civilization that once celebrated moderation now indulged in endless variety. Festivals became fashion shows. Symposia, their famous drinking parties, were half about conversation, half about comparison. Who wore what color, who smelled of what spice, whose sandals gleamed brightest under lamplight. It was all noted, whispered, judged. To be Greek in this era was to live under the gaze of others, wrapped in expectation as tightly as in linen. And yet, even in that glittering excess, you can still feel the pulse of what began centuries before. The belief that clothing, like philosophy, should reveal the truth of the human form, not just in shape, but in spirit, because underneath the gold thread and scented oils, the Greeks were still the same restless thinkers, still chasing harmony, still sculpting beauty from the ordinary. Their fashion, for all its evolution, never lost its purpose: to dress the idea of humanity itself. By the time the Roman legions had marched deep into Greece, that once fiercely independent civilization had already reshaped how the world saw itself, literally. The Greeks had taught humanity that clothing wasn't just fabric, it was philosophies stitched in thread. When the Romans conquered, they didn't just take territory, they took style notes. The toga may have become Rome's most iconic garment, but its DNA was unmistakably Greek. The Romans, ever the pragmatic copycats, borrowed the idea of draped garments and gave it a bureaucratic twist. What had once symbolized democratic elegance in Athens became a badge of hierarchy in Rome. Senators wore togas of snowy white, edged with purple stripes that screamed authority. Citizens had their own permitted patterns. Slaves and foreigners excluded entirely. Where the Greeks had wrapped themselves in freedom, the Romans wrapped themselves in law. Still, echoes of Greek simplicity lingered beneath the Roman pomp. Many of the empire's elite continued to wear Greek-style tunics at home, shorter, more comfortable, and far less formal than the ceremonial toga. Roman scholars studied in robes nearly identical to those worn by Athenian philosophers, the folds arranged to signal both intellect and indifference to luxury. It was a silent nod to the old ideal that a mind at ease needed only thought for ornament. But while Greek fashion lived on in Rome's halls, something else began to change: its meaning. What had been an expression of civic virtue became a performance of imperial power. The dye of kings, once extracted painstakingly from the murex shell, now flowed freely into Roman markets, staining wool a deep imperial purple. Greek weavers found themselves laboring in Roman workshops, creating garments not for free citizens, but for emperors and their wives. The art had survived, but it no longer belonged to the people who invented it. In Alexandria, Athens, and Pergamon, Greek fashion evolved into something hybrid, neither wholly Hellenic nor entirely Roman. Tunics were shorter, sleeves appeared, and belts grew wider. Silk, once rare and whispered about like a myth, became the ultimate luxury, imported from China by way of Parthia and the endless desert caravans. The elite of both cultures began to shimmer under candlelight, clothed in fabrics that whispered rather than rustled. Fashion had become international politics, its threads running from the Aegean to the Himalayas. And yet, in small villages far from the marble cities, Greek life continued with stubborn consistency. Fishermen in the Cyclades still wore rough wool cloaks. Shepherds still wrapped themselves in simple mantles to guard against the wind. Women still spun flax and wool at home, gossiping as their looms clicked rhythmically in the background. To them, the fashions of Rome or Alexandria were as distant as Olympus. Civilization might have moved on, but tradition had its own kind of immortality. Even in death, the old aesthetic endured. Roman-era Greek tombs still depicted men and women in the familiar draped garments of classical times. The folds were carved lovingly, almost reverently, as if the sculptors feared that to forget the chiton or himation would mean losing something essential about being Greek. Their gods, too, never updated their wardrobes. Zeus, Athena, and Aphrodite remained eternally dressed in flowing perfection, immune to passing trends. The divine had no need for reinvention. By now, the influence of Greek fashion stretched far beyond the Aegean. Egyptian garments adopted Greek drapery. Persian nobles added Hellenistic flair to their robes. Even the Celts admired the geometry of Greek weaving. The idea that beauty could be born from proportion, from harmony between fabric and form, seeped into every culture that encountered it. The Greeks had invented the language of elegance, and the rest of the world was still learning to speak it. But the true genius of Greek fashion wasn't its fabrics or dyes, it was its philosophy. The Greeks understood, perhaps better than anyone before or since, that what you wear shapes how you move, how you think, how you exist in the world. The draped garments they perfected weren't just for show. They allowed freedom, freedom of movement, freedom of identity, freedom to inhabit one's body without the tyranny of tight seams or stitched ego. To wear Greek clothing was to participate in a kind of physical democracy where every fold could shift, every knot could be undone. And perhaps that's why Greek fashion never really died. Centuries later, in the Renaissance, artists and sculptors would look back to that world of flowing linen and measured grace. Painters would dress their Madonnas and Muses in modernized chitons. Architects would borrow the same sense of proportion for their cathedrals. Even today, fashion designers invoke Hellenic lines to describe minimalism, elegance, restraint. The drape has outlasted the empire. Some say a civilization is remembered by its monuments, but Greece left something softer, more intimate. Not stone, but style. Not laws, but lines. Their clothing whispered their worldview, balance, poise, humanity, and those whispers still echo through every runway, every robe, every artist who tries to make simplicity divine. So when we picture the Greeks standing beneath the sun, marble white fabric rippling against bronze skin, we aren't just seeing history. We're seeing an idea that never stopped moving, that beauty and thought, body and spirit belong to the same fabric. And for all their wars, their gods, their politics and philosophy, perhaps this was their most enduring creation, an art of living stitched into the folds of time itself. If Greek fashion was the poetry of proportion, Egyptian dress was the hymn of endurance. For all their architectural grandeur, the Egyptians had mastered something far subtler, the art of making practicality look divine. Their world was harsher, their sun crueler, their river unpredictable. But their clothing spoke of control, control over heat, over chaos, over decay itself. Linen wasn't just a fabric for them, it was a philosophy of survival. Imagine it, a world of endless light, where every step kicks up dust and every breeze carries the scent of baked clay. Wool? Forget it. The mere thought would make you sweat. Linen was salvation, light, breathable, and almost sacred. Its shimmer under sunlight made even the poorest laborer look ethereal for a moment, as if the gods themselves had woven the air into thread. Egyptian fashion didn't change because it didn't need to. It was evolution that had already won. The genius of Egyptian clothing lay in its restraint. While other ancient cultures fussed over folds and drapery, Egyptians kept it clean, literally. The whiteness of their linen wasn't accidental. It was a status symbol. A spotless tunic meant you had time and water to spare, both luxuries in a desert kingdom. For priests, the brightness of their robes symbolized purity before the gods. For the elite, it screamed wealth. For the laborer, it was the distant dream of cool shade and rest. To wear white in Egypt wasn't just to stay cool. It was to defy the dust that ruled everything. And yet, that supposed simplicity hid remarkable craftsmanship. Linen weaving in Egypt was a high art. The finest fabrics, known as royal linen, were so thin that 20 meters of cloth could be folded to fit inside your palm. The thread counts would make modern designers blush. Ancient looms, operated mostly by women, hummed with precision. These women weren't merely making clothes, they were crafting offerings. Each garment was a prayer to Ma'at, the goddess of balance and order. To weave neatly was to uphold the cosmic law itself. The men, on the other hand, kept it short literally. The shendit, a pleated kilt worn around the hips, became the uniform of Egypt's male population. From lowly scribes to high officials, everyone tied it roughly the same way. The difference was in the quality. The richer you were, the finer your pleats, the more translucent your linen, the longer your sash. A noble's skirt might shimmer with gold thread, while a farmer's version was rough, scratchy, and sweat-stained. But both garments carried the same design. A single piece of linen wrapped and folded in perfection. It's as if Egyptian society was defined by layers. Same shape, different worth. Women's clothing followed the same philosophy. The colaceris, a tight, tube-like dress often heard up by straps, became iconic. In early depictions, it's so form-fitting that one wonders how they even walked. Yet this was part of the ideal. Egyptian art celebrated the human form, and clothing was meant to emphasize it, not hide it. The lines of the body, the curve of a shoulder, the movement of a hip, these weren't scandalous, they were divine geometry. In a civilization obsessed with eternity, Beauty wasn't vanity. It was order made visible. And then there were the accessories, because no Egyptian look was complete without them. Sandals made of papyrus or leather were reserved for those who could afford to not work barefoot. Most people went unshod, feeling the hot earth beneath their soles. But the elite, they wore status on their feet. Gold sandals for pharaohs, beaded anklets and delicate toe rings for queens. Even in death, footwear mattered. Tutankhamun was buried with more pairs of sandals than most people see in a lifetime, including one carved entirely from solid gold. Because even in the afterlife, fashion didn't rest. Jewelry was where restraint went out the window. If linen was about humility before the sun, jewelry was about dazzling the gods themselves. Colors of gold and lapis lazuli spread across chests like halos. Amulets jingled with meaning, scarabs for rebirth, ankhs for life, the eye of Horus for protection. The higher the status, the heavier the jewelry. Queens like Nefertiti turned adornment into armor, each necklace and headdress reflecting not just beauty, but divine legitimacy. In Egypt, to shine was to exist. And then there was hair. Oh, the glorious contradiction of it. Most Egyptians shaved their heads to stay cool and clean, yet wigs became an obsession. Made from human hair, palm fiber, or sheep's wool, they were sculpted into perfection and scented with oils. A noblewoman's wig could weigh several pounds, adorned with gold dust or perfumed cones that slowly melted throughout the day, releasing fragrance as she moved. Imagine walking through a banquet, smelling like lotus flowers and cinnamon, while your hairpiece glitters under torchlight. Subtle? Not even slightly. Magnificent? Absolutely. Even their cosmetics had purpose. Kohl wasn't just for style. It protected eyes from glare and infection. Perfume wasn't luxury. It was hygiene in a hot, crowded world. Every dab of oil, every smear of malachite, every fold of linen, it was all function wrapped in faith. Egyptian fashion was ritualized practicality, the intersection of survival and spirituality. To get dressed in Egypt wasn't merely to prepare for the day, it was to align oneself with eternity. Through millennia of sandstorms, invasions, and dynastic collapse, that aesthetic remained stubbornly constant. The Greeks may have brought philosophy, the Romans engineering, but the Egyptians, they had already mastered timelessness. And as we move into their twilight, we find a culture still walking barefoot on the banks of the Nile, draped in linen, polished with oil, and utterly, effortlessly eternal. By the time Greek and Egyptian cultures had both faded beneath the tides of empire, their legacies were already stitched into the fabric of civilization. Literally, their worlds, so different in geography and belief, had each answered the same question in their own way. How does a human being live beautifully in a world that demands survival? One civilization sought balance through elegance. The other sought endurance through order. Both, in their own way, succeeded. The Greeks turned fabric into philosophy. Their flowing chitons and hymations were visual metaphors for their values: freedom, proportion, harmony between the body and the mind. Their clothing was movement, geometry in motion. Every drape, every fold carried the rhythm of speech, the pulse of thought, the sway of democracy itself. Even centuries later, the world still returns to that ideal, whether in marble statues or minimalist fashion runways. It's the same ancient whisper: beauty is balance. The Egyptians, on the other hand, transformed simplicity into permanence. They took the humblest material, flax, and elevated it into an emblem of cosmic order. Their linen was light as breath, yet heavy with symbolism. It was worn by kings and farmers, by priests and the dead. It wrapped both the living and the eternal. In Egypt, clothing wasn't about adornment. It was about identity. To be clean, to be orderly, to be cool beneath the sun. These were acts of spiritual alignment. Their fashion wasn't fleeting. It was a theology of texture. And between them they mapped the boundaries of the ancient world's imagination. The Greeks taught us how to live among ideas, how to sculpt the self through beauty. The Egyptians taught us how to endure time itself, how to weave divinity into the everyday. The linen of the Nile met the drapery of the Aegean, and together they formed the foundation of everything that followed, from Roman tunics to medieval robes, from Renaissance gowns to modern haute couture. Every pleat and seam you see today still carries a thread from their looms. But beneath the grandeur of history, there's a quieter truth. For most of their people, clothing wasn't about beauty or art. It was about heat, dust, labor, and survival. A Greek shepherd tying his rough cloak before dawn, an Egyptian farmer wrapping a faded shendit before wading into the fields. These were not icons of elegance. They were human beings trying to live with dignity under the sun. And yet, even in their simplicity, they created something enduring. Out of necessity came grace. Out of repetition, ritual. Out of sweat, civilization. So, when you picture those worlds, the shimmering white linen on the banks of the Nile, the soft folds of a chiton rippling in an Aegean breeze, remember that these weren't just costumes of history. They were statements of existence. Every thread spun, every pleat pressed, every drop of perfume and speck of dust, they told the story of humanity learning how to be at home in its own skin. We often look at the past through the lens of power, kings, battles, temples, but sometimes history's truest expression lives in the smallest things, in the quiet tug of a belt, in the feel of cool fabric against sweat, in the way light filters through gauze at dusk. The Greeks and Egyptians didn't just build monuments, they built moments woven from the ordinary and made eternal by care. And that's the strange, enduring miracle of ancient fashion. It wasn't about the garments themselves, but the people inside them, the ones who spun, wove, washed, stitched, and wore them into meaning. From the barefoot worker in the Delta to the philosopher pacing a marble colonnade, they all shared the same human need to cover the body, to express the self, to touch the divine through thread and form. So next time you slip on a linen shirt in the summer or wrap yourself in something soft and light, you're echoing a lineage thousands of years old. The coolness against your skin, the way it moves with your body, the effortless grace, it's all part of that same ancient conversation, a dialogue between comfort and culture, survival and style, between the Nile and the Aegean. And maybe that's what makes their fashion eternal. The Egyptians mastered the art of enduring. The Greeks mastered the art of being. Between them lies the full story of us, our longing for meaning in the mundane, our need to turn even the simplest garment into a reflection of who we are. Linen tunics and barefoot walks, they weren't just fashion, they were humanity woven in time.